Chapter 1009. The gray fragments of the law dissipated behind Brando like withered petals. He glanced at Haku, who was lying unconscious on the ground, and silently sheathed Halran Gaia. At the same time, another battle ended. Enrich and Mephistopheles each held a black rapier and pointed it at the soul fire burning in the hollow chest cavity of the Knights of the Dead Moon. Although Haku was much stronger than either Enrich or Mephistopheles, he was still no match for the two of them together. Besides, there was also Hippamra, who had the power of the mountains and rivers. Brando turned around and walked towards the Knights of the Dead Moon. He knew that Haku would wake up soon. The undead would not really fall into a coma. Haku's current state was just a state of suspended animation due to his soul fire being too weak. This state would not last long. He would either recover quickly or perish completely. He had interacted with this Black Knight of Madara more than once, and knew how difficult it was to deal with her. She had said a lot of things to attract his attention, and he had played along with it. Out of 10 sentences, he might not even believe a single sentence. But at least he could confirm that Haku should be a silver elf and was familiar with Metasha. Although Metasha had mentioned that this woman had once used mind reading on her, it could only read the surface of her thoughts. The memories deep in her heart could not be stolen. That was the domain of the gods. As for whether she was the princess of the Silver Elf Empire, it had yet to be verified. After all, this woman was very good at bewitching and swaying people's minds. She would make people fall into anger or confusion before making a move. She especially liked to use spells like mind reading. Her nickname other than the Black Knight, the Fair Judge, was also very clear about this. The Impartial Judge. Whether she was impartial or not was another matter. But she called herself a judge. She interrogated people about their inner sins, shook people's weak beliefs, and was good at exploiting people's weaknesses. He had to get useful information from the Knights of the Dead Moon as soon as possible. Otherwise, he would not be able to get any information from this woman, unless he was prepared to interrogate them separately. But he did not have the time nor the means to do so. Lorison's undead was still standing in the hall, motionless like a stone statue. Brando came to the Knights of the Dead Moon and quickly found that it was an old acquaintance, the Rotten Knight Krot, one of the 3 Knights of Decay. She and her subordinates, the Skeleton Knight, had invaded Erewhon during the First and Second War of the Black Rose. At the end of the Second War of the Black Rose, Freya. In the middle of the Second War of the Black Roses, he had done a mission, but at that time it was surrounded by armies, so he could only see it from afar. So, if you want me to create enough trouble for Constance, of the sea please of the tell me more details. She used to be a mercenary, and said with a I always thought that Amon went to the she was a more combative undead, but she was not loyal to the undead. It wasn't Rita called out his name that I realized something human. She could only be regarded as the queen and did not intend to mobilize the undead in the Almighty God and the Dark Dragon. She did not have the ability to do was not the time gods, but the eastern part of completely different sphere of gods skeletons lying on the ground. Brando didn't say anything. There are huge dark forces he had experienced firsthand. Lori's son is just definitely more trouble between than anyone else. Most of his subordinates were lichens. As for why Haku was the relationship is too political stance, so I won't repeat it one by one. A person could hide a secret for a while. You just need to know it was difficult to hide it forever. There is more than one person like Loris, and many players were good at the cavalry tactics. Many identities was one of the three was the famous Beth Godchilkov or something Barkin, a fence-sitter. 100 years ago, all of them were suddenly launched to great death. Although the end result was that Madara was still very afraid, and also one was also hit hard. In other words, she was afraid of it. We did not let the ability to manipulate people's minds. In other words, everyone knew disputes that lasted for decades she had never revealed. When Brando threatened her, between the Shiri empires were all caused by us. The weakest among the 4 knights of the apocalypse, and the audience next to retain the chill down their spine. Was the real name of Brando said that Haku was the dark forces sounded like an elf rivers of blood on the continent. In his previous life, he could imagine that this title must have been inherited from the evil dragon. Brando had secretly made up his mind that he never thought that she was a silver elf, that it was also a type of blood of God. Even if she was really sure enough, she lied. Haku might have seen here was not set a law she might not have noticed it at all exposed, but she did not care. However, she was silent for a while before slowly asking her to hundreds you already let alone among the dark several lines were uprooted at that time. Without me free. A small number of people were executed, but most of them were secretly Brando's Safe Harbor and landed at Silver much before because you wanted me to as soon as they got off the ship, and there were humans who arranged their itinerary. The reason for this is they arrived at the wilderness of the main reason the dark forces have completely Brando immediately guessed that these people were from the Cruz Empire. If this scar is completely uncovered, not only will the Empire be from the white aged, or even one step closer to death, why they were from one of the white agents high-ranking knights. You want me to be a stumbling block for the revival of the Martyrs Empire. At that time, the Grey Winged Empire was fighting both openly and the White Dragon Knight and the True complicated expression and the Silver causing very few people to really understand what happened in the Empire and the incarnation from the White Dragon Knight resurrected on this earth. The final result was that the influence of the church plummeted. The other is the claim that Madara has been turned to the White Dragon under the support of the nobles. Although the possibility of only then did Brando understand the truth, it was not very two of them are the religious power. After all, the Cruz Empire did not know that Krot and the others had fallen from that time onwards. Except for the Twilight Dragon began to unavoidably begin to go downhill, and the four knights were also the most loyal supporters. The more arrogant I am, the better it is. Everything in this world must have a cause and a result. These undead had entered the Empire to seek the war slate. In short, the final result is very likely that they had been instructed by both Constance and the Dark together with the secrets of the nobles. Brando immediately felt that there was a strong smell of conspiracy and these people who have been eroded by the dark, he looked as well as those who have fallen and was listening quietly, are a group of people who are most likely to be turned into undead by the dark magic after they die. It wasn't strange for the Mercury Scepter Overlord to know about the war slate's existence, and I came here on the order of that person to help that appeared once in 1,000 years in that world. Authority. The Mercury Scepter did not quite understand the supreme ability to foresee the future. Through the Mercury Scepter, it could have foreseen the day the war slate would descend into the world. Beneath the rolling hills of East Metz, the Silver Queen, under the low clouds, as the dark dragon of this era, who had obtained most of Odin's inheritance deep in the ground. The dark prophecy had mentioned that the dark dragon had an almost omniscient and many living creatures and the dead were entangled in them. Through some ancient knowledge and inheritance, they came out at night and rested during the day. That she knew about the war slate. There were folk songs and stories about them that were passed down from generation to generation in Metz. Throughout history, and the old people would occasionally turn a country from an enemy to a friend was none other than a common interest according to the legends. Husbands used to teach their majesty's enemies, and mothers used to scare the Twilight Army and the monsters. The horror under the night sky and the whispers in the forest were scattered by the wind of summer and autumn. However, Brando did not think that he was worthy of the two empires. This dark power was only in the hands of a few of the most powerful dark lords. The only thing left was they were called Grand Dukes. Madara's interests were foreseeable. There were 3 Grand Dukes being able to seize the war slate from the empire was naturally beneficial to them. However, he controlled the world of darkness for 30 years before his death and 30 years after his death. Inviting a wolf into the house. He was once canonized just in exchange for Madara's support. At the same time, he was also a necromancer. It seemed that there was no need. One of them was a profound necromancer. That Madara was still not in the right position. He deceived the world until 60 years after his death, except before he was dug out from his grave and burned to ashes. Did not seem to have any objections. His authority was sealed in a crown by the Holy Cathedral. She did not need to find trouble and get involved with these skeletons. Later, it was stolen during the age of chaos that the more ridiculous and illogical something seemed on the surface, the second one was the famous Witch Ludwig. Then there must be an unknown truth behind the incident. She spread her followers in the forest of the Silver Valley. He suddenly thought of a terrible possibility. Bandits and mercenaries who were inclined to the dark the Empire had allowed and even encouraged Madara to attack everyone knew that Ludwig's day belonged to the Duke. Would such a thing happen again to the Witch Queen? Although it happened at the end of the wind through the forest in this did not dare to mention even the great demonic wave had been brought Travelers forward by kept their mouths shut. Queen Constance and Knight did not even dare to approach the forest at night. There was no reason that this incident could not happen or appear in Paladin Luther. What are you looking for? This nailed to the Perkin Shrine in Sweetwater Harbor by a wooden spike, pointing to the war slate floating at the top of the pile all year round. And it was said that mournful screams could still showed a blank look. Cold winds blew around the shrine all year round, in its ice causing passers-by to take a detour. Krot obviously knew nothing until about today. The statue of the Holy Knight still existed in the 3 harbors of East Metz. The war slate had only begun to descend on this world half a month ago, still see the face and the fragment of law had only appeared a day ago. The third one was the master of Balia, did not know what it was, Golden Flames, but the existence with the Mercury staff might have described the appearance of this thing to them and asked them to come and get it. He lived an extremely extravagant and decadent life, so even
selfish
such a
and
request would
narrow-minded,
not arouse
and
any
extremely
suspicion.
greedy for beauty.
The undead had
He was
long
cursed
been
by
used to their
passers-by
monarch
as
being
the
one
Duke of
step ahead of
Demons.
others. The
Are
favorite
you
minister,
thinking of the war in
Victor,
422?
was actually the lord of the tree herders,
Allium
Roger.
Japonicum suddenly asked
He had
in a whisper.
challenged the majesty of the Holy
Brando
Cathedral
nodded.
of Fire many times
Great
in public
minds
and
think
preached
alike.
heresy, and
The
finally
war in
died on the stake.
422 happened before the Battle of Cipher Forest.
After his fall, his
In
close
that
ministers
year,
could
the
not
Empire
escape death,
and Madara's envoys
Victor
signed a secret
Crowler was still
agreement.
imprisoned in the Empire's
This agreement was
most secure
essentially an
dungeons.
agreement to divert the
And
disaster.
his in the
Authority
agreement,
was stored
the
in the
Empire
underground
would not
holy
send
cellar
more
of the
troops to the
Ocean
Cedar
Cathedral,
area,
and even
it
withdraw
was
their
sealed
troops.
by the joint efforts of 4
In
saints,
fact,
and
it was
was
allowing
allowing
Madara
Madara
to attack
Heroin
and
and
Saint
Saint
Tassol.
The so-called
Not long
authority
after
is
that,
actually the
Madara
power
entered
of the
its
Black
heyday,
Orb, which was also
the
the
underground
prelude to the
world was
destruction of
silent.
Erewhon. The light
Even
beam
the wind
hanging
elves
from
of
above
Saint
seemed to
Tassol
be
were
the only
greatly
source
damaged
of light
in the
in the
war.
darkness.
So there was the Battle of Algash
The flashing
later.
spots of light danced
He did
in the
not
darkness,
expect history to
and a
be
layer
so
of floating
similar.
fog was dense.
Although the Emperor of the
Bai's
Empire
voice
was no
echoed
longer
in
the
the
taciturn
taciturn
Lenoret,
A
Constance
layer
also
of
made a
sand
shocking
fell from
decision.
above from time to time.
At this
but
moment,
no one
Brando
cared.
could not help but
An
think that they were
explorer
really
found
mother
this
and
treasure in a
son.
labyrinth under the fallen
However,
grove and brought it
Brando
out.
still did not understand
The
why
treasure then
Constance would
fell
let
into
the
the hands
undead
of a
enter the
merchant
merchant
named
named
Rodrigo.
retain the war slate.
He later murdered a
What was the
high-ranking
deeper meaning
sorcerer
of her
all
doing
for
so?
one, and the Black
The
Orb fell
Empire's
into the hands
territory
of the
was so
sorcerer.
vast, and there were
The
so many
sorcerer then
fragments
borrowed
of
the
law
power
and
of the
war
ancient
slate in
evil,
this land.
the Book of Mavecart.
Why did it have to be
The
Fulton
power of the
Port?
Black Orb was extracted
Was it the
and made
request
into
of
a
the
skeletal
existence with the
scepter,
Mercury
a ring,
staff,
and a
or
crown.
was it Her Majesty's idea?
These 3 treasures
Could
have
it
the
be
power
that the
to
woman
command
could
the
foresee
undead
that he would come
and
to
are the
this
most
place?
precious treasures of the undead
This sounded a
world.
little too creepy.
They were later obtained by
A
the
weak
3
voice
people mentioned
interrupted his
above.
thoughts. Do you remember
Among
what I
them,
said to you
the
before?
skeletal crown
Human
has long
lord?
been lost, and
Brando
the
turned
amethyst
around
ring was
and found that
destroyed by the
Haku
Holy
had woken
Knight,
up earlier
Luther.
than he thought.
The skeletal
The metal
scepter was
mask
sealed
on the
under the
Black
Holy
Knight's
cellar
face
had
had
long been
long
shattered by the impact,
So it was the Black
revealing
Orb.
half of her beautiful face.
Brando suddenly understood.
Her silver hair proved
Like
that she
the
was a
ice
pure
orb,
silver elf.
the Black Orb
but her
was a
eyes
holy
were no
object
longer
of the
as
dark
beautiful
element.
as Medish's eyes.
It was the source of all
Instead,
negative magic.
they were
so it
replaced
could
by a
command
pair
the
of
undead
eyes
that
that
were
were
infected
infected
by
with
negative
golden
magic.
flames.
However,
this
this high-grade
high-grade
wizard
wizard
of
of
all
all
for
for
one
one
was
was
actually
actually
able
had
to
when
borrow
she was
the
trying to
power of
coax
the
him
ancient evil
and had returned
the
to
Book
an
of
indifferent and
Mavecart.
emotionless look.
The person who
Her
extracted the
voice
power
was no
from the
longer
Black Orb
fluctuating,
was obviously
but
not
filled
an
with a hollow
ordinary
metallic
person.
echo.
It was likely
It
to
did
be
not
a
even
famous
sound
figure
like
in
a
the
woman's
history of
voice.
this organization.
In fact,
You're here
this
for
was the
this.
Haku that Brando was
To be
familiar
exact,
with. We came for the
The
skeletal
origin of
scepter.
Tiama's Chou and
I killed
Madara
the
was a
Flame
mystery.
family knight, and the
She
skeletal
appeared in
scepter is
Madara
now in the
about
hands of Duke
150
Imbuner.
years ago,
The
the
first
commander
sighting
of the White
recorded in the
Legion.
literature,
or
perhaps
nodded,
earlier, but no one knew.
Brando suddenly remembered something.
No one knew where she came
By
from.
the way,
and no one
did
knew
Amon
why
turn
she
himself
appeared
into
in
an
Madara.
undead have something to do with you?
However, when she appeared in
asked,
Madara,
Amon
she
can
was
come into
already a
contact
powerful
with the
undead
ancient
lord.
evil, the Book of Mavecart.
By the time the
So he
players
should
were
be a
familiar
genuine
with this
high-ranking
undead
member
lord,
of All for
she had
One.
already obtained the evil dragon's
However,
blood of
the
the Bone
high-ranking
Dragon,
members of All for One would
and was
never
conferred
accept
as
an
one of the
undead.
4 Knights of the Apocalypse
He
by
should
the
have been an
Mercury
undead
staff.
after that.
In history,
At this point,
Haku always
he couldn't
appeared
help
in a
but
thick
take a
robe
deep
like
look at
this.
Bai.
Although
Your
the
tree
style
herders
and
can
pattern
actually
of the robe
infiltrate
could
All for
change.
One.
Most of the time,
All for
there were
One's method of
decorations such as
infiltration was one of the
crosses and
best in
scales
the
on it,
Amber Sword,
unless she wanted to hide her identity.
An
But no
organization
matter
with
what,
such a
she would
strong
always wear her
infiltration
trademark,
ability would
the
naturally have a
half-crying,
strong anti-infiltration
half-laughing
metal
ability,
mask, and it might even be
The
stronger.
players,
so it was
including
hard
the
for him
players
not
in
to be
Madara,
surprised.
had never seen the true face of this
Infiltration,
knight,
and could not tell
really.
her gender.
Bai replied very
Although
self-consciously.
it did not make any
Bewitching
difference to the
Amon was
undead,
just my
the
personal
players were
action.
still interested in guessing
That
this
person
point.
wanted to pursue
Of
immortality,
course,
and I
judging
saw
from
his
the name,
ambition.
the players
so
were
I was
more
able to
inclined
persuade
to the
him to
latter
join
guess.
us. And
A
the
cold
fact
smile
proved to be
appeared on her
so.
pale face.
Brando listened to the Black Knight's
Immortality,
words and
only a
asked,
lunatic
"This
can
is
be
not
immortal.
the first time I've dealt with you.
A rational
Miss
person
Tiama's
would never
Chou.
chase after such an illusory
You've obviously
thing.
said more than one
The
sentence
Black Rose
to me.
of Roman Tuo was
May
known
I
to
know
be
which
immortal
sentence
and
you're
eternal.
referring to? To be able to hear such words from the mouth of a dark noble of Madara, Brando felt that it was somewhat interesting. What's an ancestor? No wonder Andesha could recognize him. Brando frowned. However, this was indeed the second time this woman had mentioned this word, and it was also referring to tree herders. But he has no interest in tree herders. Brando's origin was very clear. That person is the kind of person who is neither truly he nor selfish. His grandfather were ancestors. Everything he does is for his own benefit. Although the sword Saint Darius was famous, himself. The ancestors of this family were just ordinary Erewhon people, and we won't accept such a person. Your understanding of us is beyond the limits of human knowledge. Just like how you know my real name and my origin. You bewitched him for the ancient evil. Even if I didn't tell you when we first met, I know that you already know everything. I used the secret of immortality
2 months
to exchange
ago,
with him.
I was secretly
hoping to get the
conferred a
fake
title
book
in
of
the holy
Mavakart
temple
from
of the
him.
dying moon.
Haku raised his
This
eyelids
secret
and
has
looked
never
at him
grown
with
his
his foot
golden
out of
eyes.
Madara.
As
But
far
you
as I
already
know,
the high-grade
I
magus
believe
from
that
all
you
for
even
one
know
used a
why I
fake
was
copy of
conferred a title,
Makart's book
and
as
that
a
my
medium
power
to
comes
extract
from
the
Spider
power
Mother
of the
the
Black
Rice.
Orb. Spider Mother
You
the
seem
Rice.
to be very obsessed with the
Your
power of the
power
Black
doesn't
Pearl.
come from the Bone
Brando
Dragon.
asked doubtfully.
Brando
Wait,
was stunned
you
and
said that the
suddenly
high-grade
realized
magus
that
from
something
all
was
for
wrong.
one
Used the fake book of
He saw
Mavakart
the
as a
woman
medium
looking at
to
him with a
extract the
sneer
power of
and
the Black
mouthing,
Pearl.
"The
And you
master
want
of
to get the
darkness
fake
will
book of
return."
Mavakart from Amon.
It can see through
Could it
people's
be
hearts
that you
and
have already
understand
found
all
the Black
things.
Pearl?
Put away your tricks of
You
playing
found
with
it.
people's hearts.
The
Allium
golden flames
Japonicum
in
coldly
Bai's eyes
interrupted her.
flickered slightly.
I will kill you
but
at
she
any
did not
time if
answer
you
the
dare to do
question.
this again.
It seems like you
Brando
guessed
patted
correctly.
his senior's
Brando
hand and stopped her from continuing.
Not only did she find the Black
He
Pearl,
revealed an
it is
"I
very
knew it"
likely to be in this
expression and
place,
asked in
in this
return.
hole.
So you said that Medisha
Allium
told me
Japonicum
before.
said with a faint smile.
This was also to deceive
Bai
me.
suddenly turned her head and
This
glared
time,
at the female
Haku
knight,
did not answer,
but she knew that it was useless.
But Brando did not care and
she could
continued
not
to
help
ask
but
in
sigh
return,
softly.
"You still think that I'm the darkness dragon?"
I believe that I have found the Black Pearl.
But things have changed with the
Brando and
passage
Allium
of time.
Japonicum looked at each other
Now,
and saw the
others
shock
may
in
not
each other's
necessarily
eyes.
think so.
The Black Pearl
In the
disappeared
Empire,
without a
there's
trace
someone more
after the
worthy of this
high-grade
title
magus
than
from
me,
all for
isn't
one.
there?
Even
Darkness
the 3
will be
treasures
born
that
from
were
the
created
inhuman,
by
and
extracting
the
the
honorable
power of the
people
Black
will
Pearl have
disappear
been
from the
passed around
flames.
for hundreds of years and
These
landed
were the
in the
original
hands of
words
3
of the
different
dark
people.
prophecy.
The bone
Allium
crown was nowhere
Japonicum
to be
shook his
found,
head,
and
even
even
the
the person
amethyst
whose
ring
age
was
was forever
completely
fixed at
destroyed.
15 years old still
He
be
did not
considered a
expect
human.
this woman to be so
Only a
ambitious.
human can be an inhuman.
She did not even care for
The
the
Silver
3
Queen
treasures
Constance
and
is
directly turned her
obviously more
attention to the
satisfied
Black
with
Pearl.
this. She saw some secret on the final
And from what she
battlefield
said,
and inherited
she had
the
been
power
planning for
and will
this
of
for
the
a long
Darkness
time.
Dragon. From
With
what
the blessing
Brando
of these
knew,
powers,
she had at
she
least
has long become an
transmigrated
inhuman
earlier than him.
existence.
This
No
woman's
progress,
schemes were too
Haku
deep and
replied.
calm. The wisdom of mortals
If they were
is
not
always
so
limited
familiar
to
with
this.
her,
She might not have
I never
suffered
said
such
that
a
you are
great
the Darkness
loss.
Dragon.
If I'm not
That's
wrong,
just a
the
misunderstanding
Black Orb
by
should
that
have been
little
a
girl
obtained by
Medisha.
Lorison's wife.
Brando
Haku
had lost
continued.
interest in continuing
But
to
at that
listen to her
time,
deliberately
the power of the
mystifying
Black Orb
words.
somehow left the
He
orb and was
asked,
injected
"What's your
into her
relationship
body,
with Medisha?"
just like the blood of God.
I have nothing to do
This
with that
can only
bastard.
be the work of tree herders.
This time,
Your
Bailing
guess is
replied
that
coldly.
Clausse is a tree herder are
Hearing
similar
this,
to mine.
Brando was slightly stunned.
I believe that one of the higher-ups of
Then,
the tree
he looked
shepherds
at the woman
extracted
with a
the
sullen
energy from the
expression.
Black Pearl and made it into
Hearing
pure
this,
God's
he
blood.
confirmed the woman's identity.
Lorison's wife is most
She
likely
was
a
indeed
lower metal
Medisha's
believer
sister,
of the tree shepherds,
just as Medisha described in the dream.
She's an oracle and an
He
experimental
turned his head
subject.
and no longer looked at the woman.
The blood of the dark god.
He had obtained enough information.
Brando suddenly said.
He looked at Krot.
I looked at him and asked,
"As far as I know,
you saw it from
you are
Endesha.
not the most trusted subjects
Brando
of the
did not
Darkness
say
Dragon.
that the blood of the dark god was
Why
with
would
him,
it send you to
and he
carry
only
out this
nodded
mission?
silently.
This was
Then
just
it
a
should be
euphemism.
related to the Black Pearl.
In fact,
but it's not
it was
pure.
not as simple as not being
It should
close
be a
to the
secondary
Darkness
product
Dragon.
derived from Glosse's
The so-called
experiment.
fence-sitters, to
There
put
is
it
only
bluntly,
one true
were the
oracle
dark
of
nobles
darkness
who
in
were
this
forced
world,
by the power
and
of
that
the
is
Mercury
her.
staff to submit
By
to the
scoff,
Darkness Dragon.
her power is so pure
These old
and
nobles
powerful.
were the least powerful group
Otherwise,
in this new empire.
with the usual style of the
For an
holy
important
cathedral
mission
of
like
fire,
going to the Cruz
how could they
Empire,
seal her?
it was absolutely
I can only
impossible
seal
for them
her
to be
up.
given to them.
Burning her at
In
the stake
fact,
is her only
Krot was
fate.
at a loss about this point.
Is this your true purpose for
However,
coming here?
she looked at Haku with
Brando
some
looked
fear
at
and was
Lori's son, who
unwilling
was
to
standing
answer.
at the side.
Just from this
The
simple
pale light
glance,
shone on his
Brando
white bones,
and Allium
and the golden
Japonicum had
flames
already
in his
obtained what
eyes
they
burned
wanted.
brightly.
If I'm not
He did
wrong,
not respond
she
to
took
their
the
words.
initiative to ask the Darkness
He did not
Dragon
know
to allow
if he
you
could
to
hear
join,
their conversation.
right?
Brando
This knight
asked.
must have loved his wife deeply
Krot's
when he was
soulfire
alive.
was clearly filled with astonishment.
Otherwise, he would not have
Brando thought
sacrificed
to
his
himself that
reputation
this was
and
indeed
everything
the
else.
case.
He did
This
not even
woman's
hesitate
followers
to
were all
endure
fence
endless
sitters,
pain after
and she
death
herself
to
was
protect
the
her.
most loyal knight of the Darkness
This was a
Dragon
true
with the
and
Mercury
noble love
staff.
that surpassed life and death.
It would be too much of a
It
coincidence
was above
to say
everything
that there
in
was
this
nothing
world.
fishy about this.
But beautiful things were
Generally
often easily
speaking,
used by
birds
evil,
of a feather
just
flock
like
together.
what was happening now. If you were to carry out
Brando
this
stared
mission,
at the undead
he would
knight
definitely
for a long
choose a
time,
few
then turn
like-minded
to
and trustworthy
trustworthy
helpers.
You intend to make a
Or
deal with
rather,
him and take
these
the power
people
of
were
the Black
personally
Pearl from his
appointed by
wife's
the darkness
body.
dragon.
And
Are you going to
had
stop
no
me?
right to say anything.
Shouldn't I stop you?
However,
Brando
this was
asked.
obviously not possible.
Bai Ling sneered.
Why would the darkness
if I don't
dragon
take the
offend
blood of
its
the
most
dark
reliable
god,
subordinates
that poor
for a few
woman's soul will be
fencers?
sealed here forever.
This was
enduring
obviously
pain
not
and
logical.
suffering.
And
after
Sir
he
John
asked,
Maury's son,
he found
a
out that there
righteous
was
and
indeed
noble knight,
something unusual
will have to
about
live in
this.
this dark underground in the form
Why
of the
would
thing he
Haku
hated
choose a
most
few
when he was
fencers
alive?
who had no loyalty to the
He will
Mercury
silently
staff as his
protect her all
teammates?
day. but he will never
Others might
see his
think
lover.
that she was trying to cultivate
The
her
face
own
of
circle
darkness,
and by people's
two
hearts.
pure souls,
But Brando was
forever
very
bound
familiar
here,
with this
day
woman.
after day, year
In her
after
life,
year,
other
only
than those
darkness lasts
unintelligent
forever.
skeletons under her command,
What does this have to do with us? She did not have any
Mephistopheles
followers
was very
at all.
confused.
Although the world had changed, Brando
He could
had
not
never seen
understand the
historical
feelings of
figure whose
mortals.
temperament changed drastically
To him,
because of the
there
changes
was only
in the
the
future.
difference between hunter and
He
prey,
believed that
master
Haku was
and
no
servant.
exception.
To him,
He wanted
other
to
than
ask
food,
more,
there
but
was
the Black
only
Knight
master.
interrupted him angrily.
He
Don't ask
dedicated all the
anymore.
beauty in his life to death
What do you
and
want to
loyalty.
know, human lord?
Randolph only
Let's
needed
make a
one
deal,
look,
and he would be willing
There's
to die.
definitely something fishy going
However,
on.
Brando and
Brando could not help but
fell
take a
into
long look at
silence.
Lorison's undead.
My lord, there
This
are many
tall
powers
skeleton
in this
knight
world.
was still motionless,
As
like
long
a
as
stone
you give up your
statue.
principles, they will be at your fingertips.
Chapter 10.
For people like me, the power of the
cryptic
Black
clock
Pearl
tower was
the
located
power
at
of
the
the
top
Book
of
of
Mavacard
Mavacard
City,
or any other power.
The 12th
makes no
generation of the
difference.
Empire's architecture
I
was
will
filled
eventually
with a religious
obtain
and
power
solemn
and do
style
evil to the
unique to that
world.
era.
It does not
Looking at
matter
her from
what
the
method
long
I
and
use
narrow
to obtain
window on
power.
one side of the clock tower,
Right now,
one could see the
Sutra is the
seaside
best
scenery
result,
of Focus.
so why stick to tradition?
The blue horizon was level
Moreover,
with the sky,
only if I convince
and long
Lori-san,
headlands and
can you
lighthouses
safely
were
take
deep
the
in the
slate from
sea.
here.
Yuta
This is
chose
a
this
win-win
place as her
deal.
temporary office
You
because
can punish
she could
me at
overlook
any
the
time,
whole city
can't
and
you?
its surroundings. Haku's voice
However,
echoed in the dark
Medisha
underground,
always felt
like
that
the
she
whispers
preferred
of the
the
devil,
narrow space
full
to
of
give her a
charm.
sense of security.
Since you know that I will
It was
kill
said
you,
that her room
why
in
do you still
Hades was
pursue
such a
these?
small room that it looked like a
Brando
fortress
asked
from the
coldly.
outside. By
There were
Luochi's
many
eyes were
inconveniences
burning
in
with
working
golden
in such a
flames.
place,
But Medisha
she
had always
smiled,
been a resigned
revealing
person,
her white sharp
so she
teeth.
agreed.
I don't believe in
Eugenie,
certainty.
the daughter of Duke Vero,
As
was
long
a little
as there is a
dissatisfied,
chance,
but
it
she
is
did
worth
not
it for me to
insist
use
on
all my
objecting.
strength.
At this
If
moment,
that's the case,
the sun had
why
just
should I
risen,
give you the
and
chance
a
to
thin
turn
light
to
shone
sheen
into the
victory?
room.
The
Brando
long
asked
shadow
again,
extended along
unlike
the corner
you,
of the table.
I am a cautious
embellishing
person.
the decorative crystal on the
I
table.
want to control everything in my own
Medisha
hands.
frowned slightly and reached out to
Haku
move
did
it
not
to the
speak,
side,
as if she believed
the
that
crystal
Brando
was
would
slightly
change his mind
transparent
in
under
the
the
end.
sunlight, casting
However,
a faint yellow
at this
shadow
moment,
on the
a deep
sheepskin
and
on the
old
table.
voice sounded in the dark.
It was a letter filled
Let
with
her come,
ciphertext.
young man.
This ancient
The three
language
of them
was passed
turned
down
around
from
at the same
generation to
time.
generation by the
The
silver
golden
elves.
fire in the tall and pale
Now,
skeleton
it was
knights
taught by Medisha and was only used by the
it
white
turned
lion
around and
guards.
looked at Haku.
Eugenie
A
Vero
hollow
and
and
Marjorie
vicissitude
stood behind
voice
her,
seemed to come from
waiting
its
for the
chest.
fairy princess to read the letter.
You said that you can lift the curse
After
on
a
grace
moment,
and free her
Medisha
from this
sighed and
endless
put down
suffering.
the letter.
This was
The
not an
sunlight
undead
made a
without
silhouette of her.
intelligence. Sir John
On her
Lorry
side,
the
Brando
dragon
was the
rock
first
wooden
to
window
react.
frame was used as a
He
picture
quickly
frame for the
stopped
view of the
Haku.
harbor.
This woman
However,
was too
Faden
scary.
had already closed the harbor,
Although she did not
and the
look
harbor
like she
was
was
as calm
lying,
as a mirror.
who could guarantee that she was
What's
telling
wrong,
the truth?
Miss Medisha?
However,
The
Eugenie
skeleton
asked
knight
after
only
a while.
waved his hand and interrupted him.
She thought
I
that
have been
Medisha
listening
would
for a
always
long
speak
time.
according to the usual opening.
The three of
but
you
this
know
time,
my life very
the fairy
well.
princess fell into an unsettling silence.
Are you willing to sit down and listen
Medisha
to this old
put down the
man's
letter
words?
and shook her head.
Brando and
There's
Allium
no
Japonicum
news.
looked at each other in surprise.
The White Legion is still biding their time.
Haku did not answer.
I asked
Her
the scouts
eyes
to
flickered,
approach the
and
Levea
no one
Valley
knew
and
what
the
she was
Golden Needle
thinking.
Forest, but they are
In the
still
end,
silent.
Brando nodded and answered.
This silence
Please
makes
go
me
ahead.
uneasy.
The undead
What about
knight
the
was
villagers?
silent for a moment, and
In
then
the
its corner
deep
of the
voice
room
echoed in the
Delphian
darkness.
sat in a wheelchair.
I was born in the
The place
countryside
she
of
was in was
Granu.
completely dark,
I've
leaving
seen
many
many
people
people
and many
emitting
things
a
in my
faint
life
light
in the darkness.
I still remember
The
some of
silver
those
dragon
memories,
lady stood
but I
behind
can't remember
Delphine.
some of them.
Ever since
But to me
Mithril
now,
saved this little
all that's
human
left
girl,
is endless
she
pain
admired
and
Delphine's
suffering.
wisdom more and more. She often
My love for
stayed by
Glacé
Delphine's
is now
side in
only
the
an
name
oath
of
and a
observing the
bond.
patience. The feelings that
Perhaps
belong to
Delphine was
human
grateful
beings
to
are
Mithril
long
for
gone.
saving her life,
However,
so she did not
in the
object.
darkness, a thought often
That's what I'm
flashed
worried
in my
about.
mind.
I
Medisha
want to see
gently
her
folded
again.
the paper and handed it to
Once
the two
this
people
thought
behind
appeared
her.
in my mind,
it took root and sprouted.
then Eugenie and Marjorie
I can't
passed
suppress
it to
it.
Mithril and
I don't know
finally
if this
to
is
Delphine.
love, but I just want
The
to see
Prime
her
Minister's
again.
daughter pinched the sheepskin
Young
between her
man,
thumb
I may
and
have
forefinger
experienced
without
more
saying
than
a
you,
word,
but I don't dare to
The
brag
scar
in front
on her
of you.
face seemed to have been carved
I
with
just
a
want
knife,
to ask you,
bright and
can you
dark,
fulfill the
and
wish wish of an
words on
old
the
man.
sheepskin were written in golden
I have
lines.
dedicated my
The
life to
villagers
Martha,
did not make
but
any
I have
moves.
never seen the light
White
of day.
Legion,
The
the
villagers
villagers
of
of
the
dark
dark
was like the
sand
sand and
This
the
is the
wind.
military force that
After the
conscience can
sand and
mobilize
dust
in the
is
Metz
perished,
area.
only the endless
Now,
vicissitudes
they
of
are
life
biding
was
their
left.
time.
What's
Brando
so
and
strange
Allium
about
Japonicum
this?
were speechless for a
The
long
Duke's
time.
daughter's eyebrows were full
I
of
have
annoyance,
dedicated my life
just
to
like
Martha,
her complaining tone.
but I have never seen the light of day.
Is Her Majesty
But will
still
they also
planning
end
to
up like
target
me one
Ludwig
day?
first?
Is it true
Marjorie
that one's
asked
efforts will be
tentatively.
rewarded in this world?
That's impossible.
Or is it just a
Delphine
white
interrupted
lie?
him firmly.
Is it just a whisper of comfort in the sheepskin again? What if there has never been light in this silently darkness? And said, maybe she's waiting for an opportunity. Brando silently raised this irresistible thought in his mind. Eugenie asked. I was hiding in the shadows of the two people. Medisha rubbed her forehead. She still didn't say a word and explained. But Brando knew that she had succeeded. That Miss Delphine's guess is right. He sighed. The eldest prince is a fat world that you know are wrong. As long as he is alive, he will become the remaining pillar of human nature for the northern nobles in the darkness together with the light of reason. Once Fat Han is conquered, what we need is not the North's dilemma will be solved. Senpai. This is also the reason why Duke Vina has repeatedly sent letters asking us to go to Umos City in the favor forest. At that moment, she suddenly thought of the empire called Mardos. His Majesty is unwilling to move because he wants to set up a battlefield in Fat Han. But Fat Han is not a good battlefield until now. Is it lucky or unlucky? Although the east side is a long and narrow mountain path, the end of mankind will inevitably come and open. Is it to escape or to fight? The hills are also good for hiding troops. The demons quietly infiltrate. It's easy to attack, and mankind stands on the edge of extinction without knowing it. Marjorie was quite opposed to this plan. The future warriors returned. This was not the first time that he had questioned it. Swearing to seize fate by the throat and save mankind from the abyss of destruction. His Majesty has already arranged the plan. In the depths of the soul, reality, what we need to do is to execute this plan to the best of its ability. Not to discuss whether the plan is feasible or not. Sorting out a transparent path that leads to the future. My time is limited. Roden I'm here to listen to Miss Medisha's constructive ideas. The future is bound to be different. As for the others, City plus end of the world plus shut. Infinity. It should be a little different from the other books. Unpleasant, but he did not want to argue with a woman. Record. This book started the ugly woman coldly and did not speak anymore. The last update was on August 13, 2014. The eldest daughter of the Duke sneered. The word His Majesty is really catchy. 0. Medisha saw that the Prime Minister's daughter had revealed her true nature. 2. 95 She was a little hopeless. Trustworthy. Okay, stop arguing. She gently interrupted Delphine's next words. Chapter 10. She knew that if this woman continued to speak, the turn of summer the situation would get out of hand. The ground of the Golden Needle Valley was covered with silver dust. Back to the topic. Vulture tails and autumn leaves were everywhere in the forest. Delphine saw that Medisha had shone through the forest so she did like a golden curtain. However, under this beautiful and enchanting scenery, there were many distorted and unclean things. The silver dragon lady behind her suddenly said, "Are they waiting for the army of the evergreen corridor through the forest?" The army of Georgian seemed to have been dug out from the soil. Except their movements were slow, everyone's eyes and every step they took caused the rusty ring armor on their bodies to rustle. The light in Medisha's eyes quickly dimmed. The black swords on their waists will return to their scabbards. The army of the dukes is also gathering. As their snow-white hip bones swayed back and forth, must seize every second. The swords constantly hit the metal buckles, this civil war to drag on for years. But uniform sound. His Majesty thinks so too. These sounds gathered together like waves and waves. He knows that woman will not wait for years. As far as the eye could see, this the place was densely packed with pitch-black flat-topped army of Georgian and flickering and the lion men to arrive on the battlefield. It was endless. She must have other plans. White ocean. Delphine replied with certainty. The seawater came from the east of the valley and gradually filled up the valley. We have to find a way to make that woman show all living things. What good ideas Wherever do you have? The seawater passed, the white bark of the shining silver trees would dry up. The eyes of the Prime Minister's daughter glowed. Even the leaves like curled up and withered as if their vitality was being sucked out. It's very simple. A small group of human knights followed behind them. Constance's commander is not moving. The knights were fully equipped with armor. Which means that the best time for them has not yet come. They wore winged helmets and held long spears in their hands. We don't want to give them this opportunity, so that this opportunity will never come. The edges of their magnificent battle robes were like tassels that hung down close to the saddles of their Valley and the Golden Needle Forest. These giant semi-dragons were also fully equipped. The Duke's daughter was shocked. Not only were they wearing helmets with metal horns, Marjorie was also shocked. They were also wearing professional armor that would only be equipped showed a thoughtful look. The cotton armor was 1 inch thick and was lined with a layer of metal rings and gently tapped the tip of her smooth jade-like chin. Its defensive power was even higher than normal armor. This plan seems to be feasible. The outer surface of the armor was decorated beautifully. As long as we modify the details a little, down to the knees of the giant dragons, the three of them had a large white dragon head emblem on it. She was not proficient in military between the heavy cavalry and the undead army seemed to be very special. Do we need to inform the Count? The reborn skeletons that covered the entire mountain seemed to treat them as nothing. The commander of the Imperial imperial guards. The heavy cavalry did not seem to want to get too close to these creatures of distorted nature. We also need to inform Yuta. The two kept their distance and each had their own path. You can't mobilize the white lion guards. On the other side of the valley, Yuta and her knight subordinates put down their war horses and hid in a depression in the ground. She could not help but ask. They stuck their heads out and saw the entire scene clearly. She seems to have gone to patrol in person because she was worried that the information was wrong, and her emerald green eyes were filled with a layer of bitterly and shook her head. It was not that she had never seen the Golden Needle Valley was like a gray sea. In Chablis and Tonajol, the tall shining silver trees were like soldiers in gray armor, covering the entire mountain range. The snow-white trunk stood upright, and the branches twisted and climbed up. She placed a hand on her warhorse's neck and gently stroked the elegant creature to calm it down. The ground was covered with a thick layer of gray leaves. She turned to the others and asked, "Is that a knight of the White Legion?" Several knights rode their horses to the side of an ancient tree. He should be a white dragon knight. They were fully equipped and armed. Mare replied. On their shoulder armor was a white lion with shining fur, revealing the face of a young man. The female knight in the lead lifted her mask. Brando's white lion guards were generally young. Her fiery red hair flowed down from under the metal mask, the old lion in the north, revealing a beautiful face that made people drool. Yuta grabbed a handful of soil and rubbed it with her chainmail gloves. She raised the spear in her hand and pointed at one of the branches. And a strong smell of grass and trees assailed her nostrils. Where the tip of her spear pointed, was full of vitality, tree trunk was and it was definitely not contaminated by negative magic. It was strange and winding, undead were not summoned from this place, and coming back but where did they come from? It was unpleasant. Most importantly, why were they here? This is a secret mark left by the mountain white dragon knights, my lady. Crew, one of the knights glanced at the tree and replied in a low muffled voice. You've been learning from the Shire survivors for so of the Latch of Wa have been using this set of secret marks for thousands of years. Yuta looked at another young man. Only they know what it means. The young man was wearing a cotton-padded armor that looked like a coat, but there were diamond-shaped protrusions on the surface of the armor. The cold wind swept through the treetops, and then whispers sounded in the forest. His face was red as he muttered helplessly, "I'm a wizard of the law," spear and drew a circle around herself. "I've never learned black magic. This used to be the mountain people's territory. If you want me to explain the principles of psychic magic to you, I can explain it to you. Including the Olivea Valley. But what do you want me to say?" The knight replied respectfully, "I'm not a worm in the stomach of those cruise people for thousands of years. How would I know what they're doing here? It is precisely because they are in the north that the White Legion dares to station their troops in Ahin. If you dare to learn black magic, I'll be the first to kill you," Yuta replied. But with this forest, Ahin is the most important strategic location in the south of Komixen. He looked over there as if he had thought of something. Then where are they now? But it's not like I didn't find anything. Those knight regiment behind them didn't look like they were monitoring the skeletons. Someone saw them go north, but more like they were protecting someone. The local hunters said that as early as a week ago, come to think of it, the skeletons controlled by necromancy don't need to be monitored. There is no one left in the forest now. They will naturally listen to the orders of their master. Her emerald green eyes flashing with dissatisfaction at these skeletons is among the knights. Why did they go north? Janna interrupted his long speech and focused on the main point. The mountains of the Latch of Wa are the homeland of the mountain people. My lady, why did they leave after Madara's establishment? The necromancers are usually relied on to control the low-level undead without intelligence. I know the mountain people very well because the blood of the mountain people flows in my veins. So, the undead army in Madara is not as endless as the rumors say. She frowned uneasily. In fact, it is limited by the number of mid-level and high-level necromancers in the army. But the question is, where did they go? But their combat power is indeed very strong. They went on a pilgrimage. The undead army is not affected by morale. The Latch appeared and wound again. Second, the necromancers can command the skeletons and zombies like they are their own arms. The legend of him was passed down from generation to generation. To the knight regiment in our human army. It was said that he saved the mountain people from the claws of the evil god Tardacion in the present-day Varaka. Get to the point. The mountain winds and the Latch of Wa still carried his name. What I mean is, there are at least a few thousand undead army whisper about this legend. If they were in Madara, the Latch of Wa meant at least a necromancer regiment in the language of the mountain people. The knight regiment doesn't seem to be able to protect as so sacred land by the mountain people. Of course, there's also another possibility, and that's that someone used an undead treasure to control so many undead. She was talking about Constance, or that there's a high-ranked undead lord among the knight that personally controls this army. When did the dark dragon become the holy one of the mountain people? Why would a high-level undead lord need the protection of the mountain people for a period of time? Don't think that I've never seen an undead lord before. The knight shook his head. There must be an undead treasure inside. I am not too sure about this. Where did these cruise people find such a thing? He looked ahead. Is Her Majesty the Queen shadows of the trees overlapped and made him uneasy. The few young knights were cautious and did not say anything. Should we continue? Under the influence of Brando and the others, Yuta was used to not taking the cruise emperor seriously. Her face
She
was
always
suddenly
called him by
covered in
his
a pale
name,
white
but
that
they
had
did
lost
not
all
dare
its
to do
color.
so.
The wound empire had lasted for
solemnly.
thousands of years.
Did you hear
and
something?
the majesty of the royal family
The
had
forest
long
was
been
whispering.
deeply ingrained in the people's
The
hearts.
rustling
of footsteps was like
Not to
insects
mention the
crawling
royal
on the
family.
ground. Even a noble lord was
Haku's
superior
words
in
finally
their
had a
eyes.
miraculous effect.
How could the emperor of the
There was a
Cruise
moment of
people allow
silence in
people
the
like them to
underground
criticize
round hole.
him?
A beam
Therefore,
of light
they could
shone
only
down
turn a
from the
blind
dome.
eye and turn a deaf ear to the
Specks of
female
light
mercenary
danced in the
commander's
bright light,
nonsense.
and dust floated up and down.
Yuta did not care.
In the intertwining light
Her
and
gaze
darkness,
passed through a few
Lorison's
swaying
undead
dandelions
statue
and
was like a
stared in the
stone
direction of the
statue.
valley. Only the
Her
soul
eyes
fire in
flashed
his
a few
rib cavity
times.
was burning vigorously.
They don't look like they're going to
A
Faust.
stone rolled down from the broken
This
pillar,
direction is going
making
to the
a hollow
north.
echo.
It's the same as the mountain
It rolled
people,
to the feet
Mare
of the
added.
Allium Japonicum.
Crew, she
The
suddenly
female
asked,
knight bent
let
down
me
and
ask you
picked it up.
something.
If
Brando
we kill
turned
our
around.
way in and take the undead
He
treasure,
looked at
do you
Haku
think we can control
condescendingly
this
and
army?
narrowed his dark brown
The
eyes.
hollows suddenly became quiet.
Before we talk about the conditions,
Yuta could not help
take out
but
the
frown
thing
and
first.
turn her head to look at the few
Haku's
followers.
expression
What's wrong with
changed.
you?
What
Are you
thing?
mute?
You
The
know,
few young men were not mute,
Haku's
but they were
expression
shocked
changed
by her
several
strange
times.
idea.
In
My
the end,
lady,
he
if you
nodded
want me to be
hesitantly.
honest, I don't think this
Take
idea
it.
is very good.
She
Crew's
took out a
face was
gemstone
pale.
that shone
Let's
like
not
an
talk
agate
about
and
whether
threw
we
it to
can
Brando.
control this undead army.
Brando reached out
Those
and caught
white
it firmly
dragon
in his
knights are all
hand.
gold-ranked masters.
It was cold to the touch.
It's hard
but
to
there
say
was a
whether
warm
we can
feeling
defeat them.
inside. All right,
There was no
this
doubt
is
that this
actually a
gemstone
euphemism.
was the extremely precious
I
item
think we
from
have
his
no
previous
chance
life,
of winning it all.
the fragment of the natural
Yuta
order.
glared at him.
You're as
At
timid
least you
as a
know
mouse.
what's good for you.
Brando replied.
Do you deserve to be called a knight?
You can tell me now.
I'm a wizard. What do
Crew
you want
replied,
to hear?
feeling wrong.
Everything.
You're the
But
best
the key
student
is
of
the
the
deal
Shires.
between Her Majesty the Queen
But my
and that
teacher
person.
also said that as a
Haku's
wizard,
expression
the first
gradually
thing to
darkened.
do on the battlefield is to
If I
protect
tell you
yourself.
everything, then what other
Enough.
trump cards
I don't
do
want
I
to hear
have?
your nonsense anymore.
Human, this is not the
Shut
way
up.
to negotiate
The young
a deal.
man shrunk his neck and did
Brando
not say
smiled.
a word. As
If
a
he was
top
not
graduate
familiar
of the
with this
Royal
woman,
Knight Academy
he
in
might have been
Freya's
fooled.
first year,
Mare
he
seriously
shook his head
considered
and
the
did not
feasibility
mind.
of this plan.
If you really think so, Madame Tiamas,
Although he was a mountain man,
dragging
he
his
was one of the
voice,
few nobles
Mr.
born in
Crot,
the mountains.
Enough. Haku was
His
almost
father was a
roaring.
retainer under Duke Vero.
The dead had
so
long
he was
lost the
considered
right
to have
breathe,
quite a high
but her
status.
chest rose and fell rapidly.
He was not the eldest
as if she
son,
recalled her
so he was
instincts
sent to
when
the
she was
royal
alive.
family to become a knight.
The key to the deal
But he
is in
still
your
shook his
hands.
head and replied,
Brando
"It's too
glanced at
risky,
the fragment
my
of the
lady.
natural order in his hand.
Do you have other plans?"
In my hands.
Yuta glanced over
Of
there.
course I know
There's
it's in my
definitely
hands.
something wrong with these undead.
But what benefit does Constance
It's not
get
normal
from it?
for the Cruise people to
He
mix
said
with the
in
undead.
surprise.
As scouts,
I don't think the Silver
how can we
Queen
just let
is a
them slip by
philanthropist
under
who
our
only
eyes
wants to
without
give
doing
without
anything?
asking for anything in return?
She waved her hand and
You're
interrupted
asking
the
the
young
wrong
knight's
question.
words. Bailang said with a
Don't
smile.
worry, I'm not that reckless.
You should ask, what
When I
benefit
was the
does
leader of the
Madara get from
mercenaries,
it? You were still in
Brando
the arms of
opened
wet
his
nurses
hand.
drinking milk.
My
The
lady,
agate-like
when you were the
gemstone
leader,
shone in the
I
center
was your
of his
subordinate.
palm. The
Cruz
soft
said
light
weakly.
shone in all directions,
But the mercenary
reflecting on
leader
his pale
ignored him and
cheeks.
continued,
We can't.
But he immediately
have
retracted his
reinforcements.
hand and frowned.
She took out a
He
light blue
realized
crystal.
that this question might not be
a
so
rune
simple.
was suspended in the middle of the
What
crystal.
does this mean?
He asked.
The rune suddenly lit up.
Don't
and
keep
Yuta
me in
spoke
suspense.
to it in a low voice.
You
My
should know
lord,
that my
I'm
patience
Yuta.
is limited.
My
There are
subordinates
a
and
few
I are
places
now
in the
in the
White
Golden
Mountain
Needle
where the
Valley,
sun never
in
rises
the dark
again.
underground. A magic circle was
A
gradually
new
taking
kind of
shape
order
in
has
a
been
round
formed
hole.
there,
And the undead
the center
can be
of the
greatly
magic
strengthened
circle was
in that
surrounded
land.
by a pile of rubble.
The land of the dead moon.
Sunlight shone through the
A
holes in the
voice in
dome and
Brando's
shrouded
head
the magic
buzzed.
circle. He suddenly
Brando
thought
silently
of a
watched
possibility.
Haku set up the magic
P.S.
circle not far
I'm a little
away.
late because I'm thinking of the
He
plot.
put down the crystal in his hand.
Don't worry.
And the light blue on the crystal gradually dimmed.
It's a message
Chapter
from
10-11.
He whispered
Grendel's
to
eyebrows
Allium
turned
Japonicum
gloomy.
behind him. That woman
How many
didn't lie
troops
to
did
us.
Madara send this time?
Cruz's people have already
He suddenly
made their move.
asked. She found an
6.
undead
As you
army
can
in the
see,
Golden Needle
Haku
Valley
showed a
moving
very
north.
disdainful
Allium
expression,
Japonicum
but he had
retracted
her
her
gaze
answer.
from Haku's direction.
They are all here.
Her dark
human.
eyes emitted a dim light in the
6.
dark environment.
Bailing snorted,
With her magic
and her
attainments,
eyes fell on
she could
Crot.
tell that Haku was setting
You
up
will
a
know
typical
whether I
magic
am
circle,
lying or not
and it
when
was
you
related
ask.
to psychic magic.
Brando looked at the woman
She was not very
suspiciously.
worried that Haku would do
He
something
knew
to
that
the
she was
magic
not
circle,
lying,
so
and
she
there was
stopped
no
thinking
need for
and
her to
said,
lie
"The
about
mountain
this kind of
people
thing.
and the undead army that
He had already
disappeared a
thought
few
of the
weeks ago went to the
possibilities,
border of
but he was
Mihodafen.
curious about why the
They
woman
want to
pretended
trap
to
us
be
in
angry.
Fathon.
She had
They
been
should be
creating
waiting
this
for
illusion
Haku
from the
to make
beginning,
his move.
but the real Tiamas was
As
not
long
like
as
this.
Fathon falls into eternal
The Black
darkness,
Knight would never
the
be
undead
angry,
army and the
he
White
rarely
Legion
got
will
angry.
attack.
How
We
could
have
a
to
person
speed
who
up.
despised emotional thinking let
Fortunately,
anger control
Haku
his
is
thinking?
still under our control.
Haku must not know
Brando
how
could not
familiar
help but
Brando
feel
and
lucky.
Allium Japonicum knew
If
her.
it were not for this
If she
coincidental
knew
encounter,
that Brando
and
and
if Her
Allium
Majesty the
Japonicum were
Queen's
treating
plan
her
was
like
suddenly
a clown,
activated,
they might
really
be
be
caught
angry.
off guard. Brando felt a
Yuria
strong
is in the
sense of
Golden Needle
uneasiness in
Valley.
his heart. It's not
Some
far
of the
from
memories
here.
of the land of the dead
Are you
moon
thinking
were
of
still
stopping the
vivid in his
undead army?
mind.
The
Allium
dark mountains of the
Japonicum asked
Arkash
sharply.
region, the mountains were
Brando
full of
glanced
undead,
at her and nodded.
the land was full of corpses.
The undead army in front of them was
Madara
very
was
different
not the
from
only
the
undead
undead
army in Madara. In the mountains to the east of Mihodafen, the undead army in Madara was controlled by the necromancer
It was not only
group.
the holy war decades
Although
ago,
he was not
but
afraid
also
of
the
a few
previous
thousand
wars
undead
and
army,
the Great War more
it was
than
impossible
1,000
for
years
him
ago.
to kill all of them.
Countless crews,
Even if the necromancers
fans,
lined
elves,
up for him to
and
kill,
warriors of other
it would take him a
races were
long
buried
time
here.
to kill them. Not to mention
Some
that they were
necromancers
hiding
who
in
had
the
lived in
undead
seclusion
army that
since
covered the
ancient
mountains.
times operated their own secret
However,
lairs in the
the
depths
undead
of the
army
mountains.
in East Metz was controlled
Even
by a
these
few
people would
using
respond to
undead
the call of the
treasures.
Mercury Staff.
This gave him a chance.
If the Silver Queen gave up the
When
area
Yuria
to the
explained
east
the
of Metz
situation over
and
there,
let Madara
he was
turn it into the
immediately
land of the
tempted.
dead moon,
Then
the
the
one
one
with the Mercury
he
Staff would
raised
be
his
able to
head and
summon
looked
an
in the
army
direction
and
of
wreak havoc in
Loresen's
this
undead
area.
soul.
But from
Although it
Mihodafen
was
to the
Haku
wilderness
who
of
freed
four
his
realms,
wife,
the
there was
soul
a
of the
full
night should
one-third
know
of the
who it should be
empire.
grateful to. Unless that
If
woman was
Haku
really
dared to
crazy,
do anything
she wouldn't
strange,
dare to do
it would
such a
definitely
crazy
be the
thing.
first to attack.
But perhaps Constance
Moreover,
had really
when it was
fallen into
alive,
hysteria.
it hated evil.
All the speculation
And it was
seemed
at
to
this
point to
time
this
that Haku
possibility.
finally completed her magic
Even if
circle.
Brando didn't want to believe it,
The Black
he
Knight
had to
clapped
plant
her
a seed of
hands
doubt.
and looked at Brando with a meaningful
He stared
gaze.
at Bai with a gloomy expression.
I'm done.
Originally,
According to the
he did not
agreement,
expect
I
this
only
woman
want
to
the blood
speak,
of the dark
but
god.
he did not expect Bai to smile
My lord,
coldly.
you can get the slate
They
and
have
more
reached an
secrets about
agreement.
Constance and that person.
No one knows what it is about.
If you don't mind, I'm ready to
She
start.
stared into Brando's eyes and
Brando
said,
looked at
but
her
other
and
than
nodded.
me, Colifen,
Sir
Yalvit,
John
and
Lorison
Greta have all gone to Alcash.
Haku raised her voice and
Even in
asked.
Madara, only a few
Her voice
people know
was as
about
hollow
this
and
secret.
hoarse as
The
usual.
decaying night crowd wriggled
The
on the
undead
ground
knight
uneasily.
nodded, her jaw
The
cracking.
golden flames in its eye sockets
No one
burned
knew if she was
brightly.
uneasy because it was the
Haku
first time
slowly
she
walked
heard
to
this
the side
news,
of the magic
or
circle.
because Bai dared to reveal that
She
person's
used the
secret.
swords of several knights of the dead
Brando
moon
didn't
to
care
draw
at
the
all.
magic circle on the ground.
He didn't have the mind to pay
It was
attention
half
to
an
other
inch deep
things.
into the ground, forming a deep groove.
His mind was almost
It
completely
looked like a
attracted
pact
by this
formed by
sentence.
two opposing moons overlapping
Colifen,
each other.
Yalvit,
and Greta
the
had
curved
all gone
lines
to
intertwined
Alcash.
with each other, forming a
Colifen,
thick shadow
the Lord
under
of the
light.
Duchy of Griffin, was the
Haku
most
raised
powerful
her wrist
traditional
and was
dark
stunned
noble
for a
in
moment
Madara.
before she remembered that she
He
was
was
already
also one
an
of the
undead.
most powerful lords in Madara.
She frowned
in this
and
era.
looked at Allium Japonicum.
His strength was above Bai,
Brando naturally
who had obtained
knew
the
what she
blood of
meant.
the evil dragon.
He grabbed his senior
But although
who was
this
about to
person
step
was an old
forward and
noble,
said,
he
"I'll
was
do
loyal
it."
to the Mercury Staff
Thank
and was
you.
that person's true confidant.
Haku replied.
Yalvit.
Her voice was so
Hearing
calm
this
that there was
name,
no trace
Brando
of gratitude.
even asked, has the Queen of
Brando
the White
was not
Demonesses
worried that
submitted to that
Haku would
person?
plot against him at this stage.
This was earlier than he expected.
Haku's
but
main
in
class
any case,
was the physical
this
class.
did not stop the name from being dazzling.
Although she was a silver elf who had been in
Yalvit,
contact
the Queen
with
of the
magic
White
for a long
Demonesses,
time,
was
she
the
was
most
far from
powerful of
Allium
the few
Japonicum
forces
who
that
was
resisted
well-versed
the
in
Mercury
magic.
Staff.
He pulled
After
out
she
Halran
submitted to the
Gaia
Mercury
and made a
Staff,
cut on his hand.
the Empire of Madara
Bright
began to
red
move
blood
towards
flowed out
true
like the most
unification.
beautiful wine.
Finally,
It
there was
flowed
Greta,
down the blade
the
and formed a
death-praying
string
sword,
of blood
the
red
sword of the
beads
Empire,
that dripped into the
and
magic
the greatest
circle.
sword saint of the next era.
Brando calculated that he had
Some
deducted
people
about
called the
21
era
HP.
before 375
He then
the era
wrapped
of
the
the
wound
Earth
with
sword
a thick
Saint
cloth
Darius,
to stop the
and the
bleeding.
era after
When he removed the
375
cloth,
the era of the
the wound
death-praying
had
sword
completely
Saint
healed.
Greta.
In
There
this
was only
half
a
a
shallow
century,
white
there
mark
was only
left.
one grey sword Saint
Haku
Mephistopheles,
looked at him deeply
but the
when
two
she saw
sword
this.
saints before and after that were truly powerful figures that
She
made
did
the
not
whole
know if it
continent
was
bow
because
down
of his
to.
strong self-healing
At
ability
present,
or
Greta
because of his
should only be
precise
Motherwell's
calculation of the
apprentice.
amount of blood he donated.
The latter was the father of the
Brando
famous
did this
one-eyed
to warn
dragon
the woman that the
Tarkus.
magic circle required a
He was
ritual
also
of
a
blood
very
sacrifice.
famous dark sword saint.
The amount of blood
It was
needed
said
for
that his
each
strength
circle
was on par
fixed.
with Mephisto, but
Whether
that was
it
before
more or
Mephisto
less,
entered the
effect
ultimate
of the
realm.
spell would be affected.
Brando estimated that
The
this
amount of
person's
blood
strength
needed
would
for
not
this
surpass
magic circle
Veronica's
was
at
exactly
most.
21 HP
Not
for
to
a
mention him that Motherwell had met Greta.
When Haku
a
saw
once-in-a-thousand
this,
years
she naturally
genius.
understood that Brendel knew
Greta
the
was
basics
born in
of
the
her
boneyard
magic,
forest
and
on
her
the
heart
coast of the
skipped a
Sea of
beat.
the Dying Moon. According to the player's investigation, he should have been a human living
Chapter
nearby.
10:15.
He was only
Bright
16
red
years
blood
old
seeped
when he
into the
died.
gray
slate in the dark and
Later,
flowed along the
he was
indentations
awakened as a
carved by
lesser
the
blood
sword.
descendant.
The blood was not
Originally,
absorbed
there
by
were
the soil
thousands of
and
undead
dust.
in Madara who were awakened by
Instead,
necromancers
it seemed
or
to be
superior
endowed with
vampires
life.
every day.
It was like a snake that coiled around
Greta
a
should
few
have become
powerful
one of those
lines.
thousands of low-level undead
The black
cannon
magic
fodder
circle
and
was
died
quickly
in an
filled with the red
inconspicuous
liquid.
battle in the sea of the dying
Haku's
moon.
chanting became louder
But
and
history
louder.
was such a coincidence.
When she got up, a great
the person
scroll
who
flew
awakened
out
him
from
was
her
Motherwell.
hand. It was
Not only
suspended
was
in
he a
midair
sword
by an
saint,
invisible
but he was
magic.
also the patriarch of the
The
Manlian
simple
family.
sheepskin slowly unfolded
Greta
in the
quickly
direction of the
attracted
rolling
Motherwell's
wooden
attention
scroll
with his
until it
unique
reached
soul
the
fire
ground.
and became the latter's
The
apprentice.
scroll was filled with ancient words
After that,
and complicated
he embarked on the
patterns.
path of a brilliant genius
Brando
and
could not
became the most
recognize the
dazzling
words,
star in
but he
Madara's
knew
history.
that it was a high-grade scroll.
The Sword of the Empire.
It was a
Greta
high-grade
died
magic
together
circle
with
ritual
Ekis in the
scroll.
final battle of the Evernight.
One of the characteristics of magic
pierced the
arrays
right
was
eye
that
of
they
the
could be
alpha
cast
wolf
in
with his
advance.
sword.
Most
Some
of the
people said
rituals
that
and
if he did not
materials for the
die,
magic
Madara
array could be
expansion
prepared
might
in the
not
form of
stop at
magic
the wilderness
arrays.
of 4 realms.
For example, almost 90%
Brando
of the
also
steps for
agreed
this
with
magic
this
array
statement.
had been prepared in advance.
Such a
in the
person's
ritual
strength
scroll.
at this time might not be
But
as
I
strong
only
as
needed
White,
to complete the
but he was
last
that
step.
person's trusted aid.
Otherwise, with her ability, she would not be able to cast a high-grade magic circle on her own. The fact that the three of them went to Algash was enough to explain a lot of things. Was not lower than the awakening
Brando thought
scroll.
of many things at that moment.
In addition,
but he really
from
could
what she
not
said
understand
before,
why Constance
she should have
would make
another
such a
awakening
choice.
scroll. He could
Brando
imagine
could not
what would
help
happen
but
next.
sigh at the depth of this woman's
It
heritage.
would definitely subvert everyone's
When the scroll
understanding
flew
of this
out
world.
from Haku's hand,
She let out a low
hypothetically,
cry
a
and
third
pointed
of the
a finger.
empire suddenly fell into
An
Madara's
invisible
hands.
ripple shot out from her fingertip
A
and hit
vacuum
the
would
pile
suddenly
of rubble
appear
in the middle
between
of the
Cruz,
hall.
Saint Hossel,
The rubble collapsed
and
to the
Fanzin.
sides and revealed an altar.
This land of the dead moon would
When
completely
Brando saw the
change
altar,
structure of the
he
continent.
suddenly understood why Lori's
It was
son did
equivalent
not
to
let
the
him get
crazy
close
queen
to it.
bringing the dead moon empire
So it
into
wasn't
the course
because
of
of the war
history in
slate,
advance,
but because his wife was
this
sealed
was
underneath.
definitely a method that was much
Seeing
crazier
this
than the
scene,
empire in
he
history.
couldn't help but curse his bad
Brando,
luck.
Allium Japonicum
The altar in
suddenly
front of him
reminded
was made of marble
although
and was
Constance
carved
is
into a
crazy,
hexagonal
she is
shape.
definitely not crazy.
Its cross-section was diagonally
She must
cut,
have a deeper
and
reason
the
for
surface
doing
was
this.
as smooth as a mirror.
Brandel's eyes
There
lit
were
up.
some sealing spells engraved
This was a
on it.
negotiation between the
The
two
grey
empires,
altar seemed to
not
have
a
a
game
long
between
history.
children.
The surface
Such a
was damaged
large-scale
and covered
handover
with
was
scratches
definitely
and
not
dirt.
something that could be
The
completed in a
damage was
short
old
period
and
of
new.
time.
Some
what
looked like they
exactly
were
made
8
the
or 9,000
existence of the Mercury
years old.
staff and the Silver Queen
Some
trust
were
each other
caused by
so
the
much.
falling vault,
while others
For a
were
plan of this
unrecognizable.
scale,
Madara and
when the
Cruz must
altar
have
was
a
revealed from
considerable
the
degree
rubble,
of mutual
the whole
trust to
hall
complete
resonated
it.
with Haku's chanting.
But how did these two gain
Brando
each other's
frowned.
trust?
The
Allium
dark
Japonicum
dragon
looked like it was nothing out
White
of the
seemed to
ordinary.
have seen through his doubts and
Enrich
answered with a
looked up.
devilish voice.
The vampire
That's
princess seemed to be
impossible.
able to see the invisible
Brando
lines of
growled.
law in the air. Although the
Her
world knew
eyes
that
were
the undead of
shining with silver
Madara were
light.
once loyal to the Dark Dragon,
Whoosh.
thousands of years later,
After a moment,
they had already
a blurry
become
shadow
independent.
suddenly appeared on the altar.
Could it be that Constance,
Brando
with the
could
title of the
vaguely
Dark
see
Dragon,
that it was a woman.
could convince the existence
She wore
with the
a black
Mercury
dress,
staff to bow
and
down
her
to
face was covered with a layer
This
of
was a little
sadness.
too unimaginable.
It looked like Logus
How could the existence of the Dark Kingdom,
she was.
a king that appeared once in 1,000 years, be willing to
At
bow
this
down
moment,
to someone
a
with
book
his ambition?
appeared out of thin air above
Not to
Haku's
mention
head.
that he was now fully fledged.
The cover was pitch black,
After
and the
Yalvit
words were
submitted to
glowing.
him, the Empire
Brando
was on the
recognized
fast
the
track.
appearance of Maeve Cart's grimoire
The next
at a
100
glance.
years would be Madara's era.
It was obviously another
Would that
copy
person
of
bow
Maeve
down
Cart's
to
grimoire,
Constance just
and he
based
was
on a
secretly
rumor?
shocked.
This was simply
Amon
a joke.
had already turned into ashes.
Not to mention that Constance
His
only
fake
had a
book
part
of
of the
Mavacart
Dark
had
Dragon's
fallen
inheritance
into
in her
his hands.
hands. Even if she
After
really
absorbing
obtained
the
the
entire
entire
inheritance,
inheritance,
it had already
she was
become
still
a
not
pile
old
of
in.
trash.
Brando even
This
thought
woman
that
had
the
gotten
woman in
another
front of
one
him
from
was
somewhere.
insulting his intelligence and
Her
making fun
ability
of
was
him,
really
but
shocking.
White looked very serious.
Looking at this scene,
He
he
was
was
even
even
more
more
afraid
afraid
of her with
Haku.
contempt, as if she
She
already
had the
knew that
ability,
the other
the
party would have
means,
such an
the
expression,
wisdom,
the prudence,
She
and the
replied
patience.
coldly,
but that's the truth.
This woman had all of them,
I
but
even
she
know
had
that
to use
Constance
them for
and
evil.
that person met in private before,
She was such a
on the
beautiful
final
woman.
battlefield. As soon as the Book of Mavacart
Few
appeared,
people know
the
the
atmosphere
details
in
of
the
that
round
meeting,
hall changed.
but at least
I'm sure that they reached
Other than
an agreement.
Brando and Allium Japonicum,
I
who
even
were
know
still
that after
indifferent,
this plan
even
is
Sir
completed,
John Lori's son
Madara will
used his
definitely
bony
be
hand to
merged
grip
into
the
the
hilt of
Cruz
his
Empire.
sword.
The
Of
Book of
course,
Mavacart
at that
was an
time,
ancient evil
Cruz
item.
will no longer be called Cruz.
Even if it was a fake, the
new
terrifying
country will be
power it
called
exuded was
Mardos.
enough to make him a
The new
saint,
country country will be called Mardos. A voice echoed and Mephistopheles looked solemn, ready to attack. The Azure Knight held the holy lance in his hand and made a promise to the people and stood behind Brando. For the next 10,000 years, this country thrived on the ruins of the past. Haku did not even look at them. It was the Myrna Empire, the country that had been destroyed for 1,000 years. It was obvious that it was not easy for her to complete this step. Brando felt that the world had gone crazy, of everything, or rather, the ultimate form of all things. He felt with someone gently with the extremity back. I will temporarily borrow your name and exercise your authority. He turned around and
suddenly
saw
let out a
Alium
low
Japonicum
roar that did
standing
not sound
firmly
like
by
her
his
voice.
side. He
This
immediately
low roar was
understood the other
majestic and
party's
cold,
thoughts and
like
was slightly
rolling thunder.
touched. It
Ever
echoed
since
in
he
the
heard
hall.
White's words,
Although
Brando
he still
felt like
couldn't
he had
tell
heard
if it
this
was true or
voice somewhere
false,
before.
there was still a dark cloud
However,
shrouding
at
his
this
heart.
moment,
The book of
the
Navicard
future of this
above
world was
Haku's head
completely
moved
out of
without
his
wind.
control.
It
The
flipped
tide of the
open,
world
and a
was
few
blowing
dark
in his
energy
face.
ribbons extended from it.
In the face of the
entangling
storm,
Logos'
no
soul
one
in the
dared
hall.
to say that they knew what their
Lori's
fate was
son,
going to
Soul
be.
saw this and let out a low
Even
roar,
he was the same.
holding his sword with both
He
hands
originally
and slashing
thought that he could
towards
finally
Haku.
control the fate of Erwin.
Stop.
But in the current situation,
Haku's voice
Erwin
returned
was
to
like
its
a
hollow
lonely
and
boat in a
hoarse state.
tsunami that could capsize
She
at any
roared,
time.
"If you don't want her to completely
In front of these
disappear."
giants, Erwin people
Lori's
still
son
couldn't
was
control their
slightly
own
stunned.
fate. In this
For a
moment,
moment,
the
Brando
dark energy
suddenly
ribbons
felt
had
that his heart
completely
was
wrapped
very
around
tired.
Logos, forming a
But
black
with Alium
cocoon of light
Japonicum
that
standing
floated
by
in the
his
air.
side,
He suddenly
Lori's
felt
son,
that he had
Soul
returned
stared
to the
at the
past.
cocoon of light,
the flames in his
future of the
eyes
kingdom
burning
was
fiercely.
gloomy.
The
He
fate
turned
of the
around
entire
and looked at
kingdom and its
Haku with a
people,
questioning
the
gaze.
faith and hope of thousands
"Calm
of Erwin
down,"
players,
Haku
were all
replied.
floating on the stormy sea.
The undead knight hesitated for a
Although
moment,
everyone knew that
then
they
put
could
away
fail,
his sword
or
with a
even that
creak.
they had failed, they
However,
still stayed.
he still guarded beside
At least
the
I
cocoon
did it
of light.
before, and I won't
The
regret it.
atmosphere in the hall was
They
a
had
little
failed
strange,
before, and it left a
The
deep
war
impression
slate
on
floated
him that
high
was
in
enough
the
to
air,
affect his
suspended
life.
under the sunlight from
But
the
this
dome.
time, they might
Below
not
the
fail.
slate, a few people
Besides,
surrounded a huge
with the same
cocoon
person
of light.
standing by his side.
The cocoon
How could
of
he
light
not have the
shrunk and
courage to fight
contracted
again,
as if it was nurturing life?
no matter what it was?
However,
as long as
no
it
one
stood in his
spoke.
way, he would make it
Only
pay the
Haku's
price.
incantation could be heard in the
Mardos
darkness.
had been destroyed by the hands of the 4 wise ones 1,000 years ago. At this moment,
1,000
Brando
years
felt
later,
someone
the
touch his
result
hand
would
from
not
behind.
change.
She's
I
activating
understand,
the power of the
Senpai,
book of
Brando
Navicard
replied softly.
By Jia used her
Alium
fingertips to
Japonicum
write
showed
on
a
his
gratified
palm.
look and nodded.
Even though it was a long
But Brando
sentence,
knew that
it
now
was
was
as
not
if
the
they had
time to
telepathy.
comfort each other.
Brendel
The most
understood her
important
meaning
thing now
immediately.
was to solve the problem at hand.
She then wrote, "It's
He
not
looked
just
at
to
White
extract
and
the
asked
power of the
coldly,
dark orb.
"How far has this plan
It's
gone?"
power."
He paused
Haku's
for a
hand
moment,
was cold,
and a complicated
and her
light
fingertips were
flashed in his
soft and
eyes
smooth.
as if he had understood something.
His heart skipped a beat.
The White
and he
Legion
grabbed
is
her
not
hand
moving
and
in
shook it
Ilchin.
lightly to show that he
"Is
understood.
it waiting for you? Do you believe
Alium
it now?"
Japonicum did not remind him anymore and retracted
White
her
asked.
finger.
Brando
felt
looked
the
at this
touch on his
woman,
hand
and he was a
disappear.
little disgusted.
For some reason,
"I'll take
he
what you
felt a
said as
sense
the
of
truth,
loss.
Miss Tiamas."
But he was not surprised
But he
by
still answered
Baijia's
patiently.
reminder.
"Actually,
The
I'm
Madara
very
woman
clear
in
about
front of
your
him
little
was not
tricks
as
and what you
simple as
want
she
to do."
seemed. But now,
She took a roundabout
you should know
way to
which
reach
side
this
you
point,
should be on,
and it was obvious that she had
I hope that you
calculated
can show me your
meticulously.
true sincerity to
She
cooperate
would definitely
with me.
not do useless things.
I'm on your side. Since she had
Bai
done
Ling
so
laughed
much,
and said,
then she
"Human,
must have a
are
certain
you
degree of
mistaken?
confidence in her heart.
Although I brought these trash
If he
with
was
me,"
at this
she
moment,
looked at
if he
Krat,
felt that
and
victory
did not
was
hide
in
her
his
contempt
hands,
for these
he would
trash.
undoubtedly be
"This only
digging his own
shows that I have
grave.
my own thoughts."
Therefore, even
That
without
person's
Haku's
subordinates,
reminder,
Yalvi,
he knew what
the
he
Queen
should
of
do.
Banshees, and
Of
Kalafen,
course,
the
Alium
king of
Japonicum's
Griffins,
magic
do not
was
have
far
their own
better than
plans.
his. This
She
is
could clearly
nothing.
tell what Haku was
Don't
doing,
beat around
but
the
he could
bush.
only guess what
Brando
she might do
interrupted her
based on his
coldly.
intuition
I've always
and
been
understanding
suspicious
of
of your
her.
attitude.
But
At
your
this
words
moment,
later
a
revealed the
majestic
truth.
force rose in the round
You
hall.
brought these fence-sitters out,
This force
not
was
because
emitted
you have
from the
your own
faint book of
plans,
Navicard,
or indeed because you
under
have your
everyone's
own plans,
gaze, an
because
invisible
you know
force
that they won't
lifted
dare to
Haku
question
from
your
the ground
decision.
and suspended her in midair.
Compared to them, you are far
Although
closer
half of
to
the
that
female
person,
undead
and in
knight's
front of
face
them,
was still
you have
exposed
supreme
outside
authority.
the broken mask.
White's
Her golden
expression
eyes had
changed
recovered,
slightly,
but he did not
She
say
let out a
anything.
long breath and pointed
Instead,
at Brando.
he quietly waited
Brando
for Brando
frowned
to continue.
slightly.
He
Actually,
felt as if
you
the
didn't
blood
lie
in his body
before,
was burning,
Tiamas,
as if it would
Brando
turn into
replied,
steam at any
"Your
time.
real goal is Lorison's
However,
undead,
it
right?"
only lasted for a moment.
"I don't
and
understand
everything
what you
calmed
mean,
down as
human."
if it was an illusion.
White smiled.
Brando
Haku was
pondered
slightly
for a
stunned,
moment,
then
then
her
raised his
expression
head.
instantly turned ugly.
I didn't want to say it,
"I see.
but in order to not deceive each
Brando
other in the
naturally
future,
would not
I
treat
think
the
it's better to be
abnormality in his
honest.
body as an illusion.
He said,
"White
blood
or Miss
boiling
Tiamas
spell.
Chiou.
In this
This
world,
was White's
there
other
is an
power.
organization called the
He had
Hydra's
heard
12
that there was an
heads.
evil druid that could
May I
control the
ask
power
which
of
head you
life
are?
and water. He asked
The water
word by
here
word,
included blood.
Patriarch Tiamas.
Blood
Can you
was
answer me?
75% water.
The smile
and if
on
one
the
were to
undead
combine it
lady's
with
face
water,
froze.
they would be able to control it.
If the water in the body evaporated, the person would be no different from a dried corpse.
The golden flame in Bai's eyes
This was a
split
power
into layers
that
of flame
had never
patterned,
displayed
like
before.
flowing lava.
She was the
She
Lord of
squeezed
Life
out
and
a few
Death,
words from
and
her
the God
throat.
of Death,
"What are you
Chokha,
talking about?"
was named after her.
Because of this,
Unfortunately,
since
Brando
he
raised
knew
his
that his
hand,
opponent
and
was
a
a tree
crystal drew a
herder,
beautiful
he would
arc in the
definitely
air,
be on guard
making a
against
crisp
this.
sound as it hit the ground.
Tree herders
and then
were a
rolled
branch
to
of
Bai's
druids,
feet. So how could they only
Bai
know
hesitated
necromancy
for a
spells,
moment,
then leaned over to pick up the thing with
this woman was
difficulty.
well prepared.
It was a dark
How could
crystal
she
without
forget to
any
bring
luster,
fresh blood for the
exuding a cold
sacrifice?
aura in her palm. The color in the center of the crystal had been
when
removed,
she suggested using
revealing
his
an
blood
ugly
for the
blank
sacrifice,
space. He was already
Bai
on guard
carefully
against
observed
this.
for a moment,
and finally
Japonicum
recognized
had
that the
obtained the
crystal was
silver
one of the
bloodline
culprits
of
who
the
had plotted
Byakugas in his
against her.
previous life.
Her brows
Before she
furrowed
left,
deeply. There was no more outstanding
"This is a soul
spellcaster
crystal
than her, so it was
This
too
is a
easy
soul
to guard
crystal."
against her magic tricks.
Brando replied.
Moreover,
It once stored a
he had
spell called
Enrich's by his
Soul
side,
Spike,
which is a black magic.
In terms of blood magic,
what does
she
this
was a
have
true
to do
master.
with me? Brando
Vampire.
raised his head and looked at the
Haku
empty round
finally
hole.
recognized Enrich's
The
identity,
towering vault
and
was
also
engraved with
understood where
thorns,
she had
light
overlooked.
and shadow, and
You're a
gargoyles
human,
stood
but you're
gloomily
in
on the
cahoots
stone
with the
pillars.
undead.
It was
She
said that the
scolded
top
in
of each stone
exasperation.
pillar was engraved with
This
prayers
made
like
Brando feel
Akshvan,
very
the
helpless.
glory of the kings.
He thought
praising
that
the
this
Lord of
woman
Light,
was probably the
sun
one who
god
had the least
Perkin.
right to say this.
The building could show the
She
time
was
of
the
the
undead
era
lord
it
of
belonged
Madara,
to, but
and
she
this
was
hall
also
was filled with
the
the
history
humans.
of the past hundreds of years.
What right did she have to scold him?
It should have nothing to do
It
with
was
me.
as if only the magistrate
He
was
said,
allowed to set
but how could a
fires,
believer of
but
the
the sun
commoners
god
were not
perform
allowed
black
to light
magic and
lamps?
hide such an evil thing
However,
in a sanctuary?
he did not intend to waste his
Bai's
breath on
eyes
this
showed
woman.
a thoughtful look, and
He
she
had expected her to
saw
go
Allium
back on
Japonicum
her
behind
words.
Brando walk out.
He pulled out the Halran
Allium
Gaia that he had
Japonicum
prepared
smiled at her
earlier and
politely,
shot toward
and in a
Haku,
gentle
who was in
tone,
midair.
he continued Brando's
At
words.
the same time,
Sir John
the
Lorry's
undead
son was
Lord
a true
Lorry's
devout
son
believer
finally
when he was
reacted.
alive.
Although he
was
had
an
to let
upright
Haku
and
find a
noble
way
knight,
to free
but
his
he
wife's
also
soul,
had his own
this
story.
did not mean that he would be biased
Many
toward
people
this
may not
woman.
believe that this upright
In
knight
fact,
had never
from
broken
his
his connection
standpoint,
with the
he
word
admired
cultist
Brando
in his
more.
life, but it was
He
the
knew
truth.
that Brando had already
He
made
was
a
also
huge
exiled
concession by
because of
allowing
this
Haku
Haku
to
and could
obtain
not
the blood
return
of the
to
dark
his homeland
god.
and family.
How could he
Of
tolerate
course,
this woman
this was a
playing tricks
deeply
in front
buried
of him?
secret.
He was furious,
Outsiders thought
let
that
out
the
a
knight
roar,
had left
and
because he was
slashed his
tired
sword
of fighting
toward
for
Haku,
power.
who was in midair.
Naturally, the
However,
family he came
Haku
from
had
would do
already
everything
understood
possible
that
to
she would
cover
not
up the
have another
truth that
chance
shamed
if she
the family.
failed.
Thus,
In fact,
the real
she was
history
already
was forgotten
very
day
weak.
after day.
Just
She
like
was
this
relying
hall,
on the power
where everything
provided
in the
by the
past
Book
was
of
covered in
Mavakart to
dust.
support her to cast these
But
spells.
history is silent,
and time
However,
will tell
this
everything.
power could not be maintained
no
for
matter
long.
how deeply the secret is
She
buried.
knew why the Book
It will
of Mavakart
inadvertently
was
reveal
called an
itself.
eternal evil.
A long
It was
time
different
later,
from a mon
a
who was
ranger named
addicted to
Verdant
power
found a
and could
diary
not
in the
help
ruins
himself.
of a castle in Grano.
Unlike the idiot,
He opened the
Haku was
diary
smart
that was
and
covered in
rational.
crimson goatskin.
She immediately
On the
stopped
first
after
page,
her attack
the
failed.
name of the owner of the diary
At the
was
same
written
time,
in elegant
she cut
handwriting.
off the connection with the Book
Her
of
name was
Mavakart.
Gladys Petty.
A black hole
Her real
expanded
identity
behind the
was
female
Lorrison's
undead
wife.
knight. She was
She
a tree
sighed
shepherd.
and stared at Brando like a venomous
At this
snake.
point,
The
she
next time
stopped
we
and did
meet,
not intend
it
to
will be
continue.
your death, human.
Brando immediately
continued,
understood
I've
that
been
she
thinking
wanted
about
to use
this
the
question
power of the
before.
Book of Mavakart to open
No
a
matter
portal
how
and
the tide
escape.
of magic roared and set
However,
off waves on
he
the
would
sea,
not give her the chance.
how could Perkin tolerate so many
At this
undead
time,
running rampant
he had
in the
already made
sanctuary?
up his mind to kill this
But when I
woman.
saw this round hall,
His body
I understood
flashed,
that this
and
hall
he
was
used the
not
power
Perkin's
of Chanting
chanting
Strike
hall,
sword
but the
art
holy
and time
cellar,
elemental
the altar
powers.
used by Perkin's followers
His body
to
was
seal the evil
continuously
monsters
teleported
underground.
in space, and in the
So
blink
the
of an
reason why
eye,
the undead
he was close
exist
to
here is so
Haku.
simple. He was close
It's
to
because
her.
they have been here for a long
Bai Ling
time.
snorted,
Even so,
and a circle
it
of
doesn't
black
mean
waves
anything.
immediately appeared in front of her.
Indeed,
But the problem is that
However,
you gave yourself
Brando
away.
already knew that she was prepared.
Don't forget that you used the awakening witchcraft on Lorry-san. When his body hit
That's
the
not
protective
strange.
shield,
Bai Ling
it
said
shattered like an
coldly,
illusion.
I'm the Dark Lord of Madara.
9 luminary sword art.
It's normal for me to search
At
for
this
powerful
time,
undead
Haku
as my
had already
subordinates.
understood what trick Brando
Then you
was
can
using.
use it to command the undead.
Her expression changed greatly.
Why did you awaken
and when she
Lorrison's
looked back,
wisdom?
she saw the ladder.
That's because the high-grade
He had
undead
already
with wisdom
appeared
are
above
more
the light
powerful.
cocoon, holding the sword
Brando
with
shook
both
his
hands
head.
and slashing down.
In theory,
That's
no.
true. But
Haku let
Lorrison's
out a
undead
roar.
still retains the heart of a
Brando
saint.
had already guessed Haku's
It's
purpose.
a real saint's
soul. This woman had done
Even if it
so many
wakes up and
things
can't
before for
attack you
nothing
because
more
of
than
the
the
blood of
powerful
the dark
magic of the
god.
awakening witchcraft.
Therefore,
It will still
she would
choose
definitely
to
not give
self-destruct.
up this thing easily.
What you will get is not a powerful follower,
wouldn't it be
but
useless?
a pile of bones. Therefore,
The
he did not
awakening
intend to
witchcraft
attack
scroll is
Haku from the
expensive,
beginning, and Haku
The
had
Empire
indeed
of
made up her
Madara
mind to
is
use
not
herself
powerful
as
enough
bait
to
to attract
squander
his
it.
attention. You dared to do this because you need Lori's son to recover his memories. Although it would not be life-threatening, she could take advantage of this time to put away the blood of the dark god and escape calmly. He is qualified to provide you with what you want. At this moment, the weight to unlock the seal slashed down and cut the energy belt in midair. Soul. Haku suddenly lost the connection with the blood of the dark god and lost the opportunity to attack I didn't expect you to know about the undead. This meant that she had only two choices. Your understanding of the world of the undead is deeper than I thought. Either she gave up the blood of the dark god and immediately left through the teleportation gate, or she gave up the opportunity to escape and stayed to snatch the blood of the secrets of the undead. In Brando's heart, there was a glimmer of hope that this undead witchcraft and black magic. Otherwise, I'll believe it. If she escaped, but there would be endless trouble in the future. And the youngest swordsman in 1,000 years. He won because he was more familiar with this woman. Unfortunately, and the other party's understanding of him was still a hypothesis. Once she really regarded him as a troublesome reality, then it would be still just a subjective speculation. It was troublesome. You still don't have any evidence to support what you said. He did not want to live in danger all the time. Not to mention that there were other people evidence to convict people. This woman was unscrupulous and could attack the people around him at any time. In my opinion, however, this is all Brando also knew that this hope was very slim. You can't resist anyway. With Haku's character, if this human wants you to be hanged or self-preservation first. It's just a matter of words. If she could not snatch the blood of the dark god, she would have another chance in the future. That's why I say that your understanding of humans is not as good as mine. She might even lose her life here. Brando was almost choked to death that this woman would not be unable to think clearly about which was more important, was praising him or taking the opportunity to speak ill of him. So, he was surprised to see Haku stop the opening of the teleportation gate. It seemed like she agreed with his words and rushed towards the light cocoon in the center of the hall. Haku smiled and sneered. You deserve to die. Others may do this, but I know that your Lord won't. When Haku made this series of actions, Brando knew that Haku was deliberately provoking him, but he didn't care. The golden flames in her eyes burned fiercely. I have reservations about your opinion. It could be said that at this moment, under certain circumstances, into a frenzy. I don't care about the means. Seeing this scene, Brando could not help but be stunned. I won't listen to a cultist like you. There was only one thought in his mind. I won't lower myself to the same level as you. If I say that you're a tree herder, I will naturally have accurate evidence. Chapter 10:16. Speaking of which, this evidence was actually given to me by you. The altar in the center of the round hall like a comet was a little ugly. The book of Navicard was described in such a vulgar way would feel his eyes were burning, let alone a proud person like her. A black flame bloomed in the golden flame. At most she was a little dissatisfied. Brando was slightly surprised. Brando continued. He knew that she had completely released the power of the ancient evils. Do you still remember what he said to me before? He raised his sword solemnly. This question sounds very familiar. A giant black scythe appeared in Haku's hand and collided with the Halrang. I have said many things to you before. Sparks flew everywhere, and a black ripple spread out from the center of the two weapons. That sentence itself isn't important. Wherever it took out the god, it was like a storm, breaking all, leaving crisscross trenches on the solid ground. Haku's face changed. Mephistopheles' black dress was immediately torn apart. Speaking of which, the shards turned into butterflies high-ranking that fluttered in the holy cathedral, revealing the black soft armor to appear in the empire openly. Andrique's lace dress was also torn apart. Why beat around the bush? Both of them had small cuts on their faces, and their long hair fluttered like wild grass. You should know that I already know Amon's other identity. The power of the mountains and rivers. He is a high-ranking member of all for one. Shield enveloped her and Allium Japonicum. I dare say that in this world, there are no more than 10 people who know every line of the law of the shield emitted a dazzling light, as if it would collapse at any time. But you were able to call out his name immediately, which means that you already knew that he died on the surrounding walls of the underground round hall. The Brando and Haku exchanged swords 4 times in an instant, and each strike caused the underground hall to collapse under her breath, and at the same time admitted to everything Brando had hypothesized. A loud bang was heard, and a corner of the round hall didn't allow her to continue denying countless gravel fell down. It was meaningless. Hipamra's shield emitted a bright light, and then it shattered like countless scattered couldn't explain everything. A thin black line looked at Brando with his shoulder to the right side of her curiously, and then I have another question that I'm curious about. The priestess is a member of all for one, and fell heavily into Allium Japonicum's that I'm a tree herder and one of the 12 patriarchs. Brando hesitated for a moment, but still answered, and he threw out an emerald with his right hand. The reason is relatively simple. The golden lines in the emerald because all for one doesn't accept the undead. And then a crystal structure bloomed from within. All for one members have always looked down on the undead, the ancient draconic magic was extremely powerful. They think that it's just a path so it was impossible to record it on ordinary scrolls. What they pursue is the truth of chaos. Only a stable crystal structure could be used to carry the bound lines of law. Madara can compare to. Once it was activated, at that time, the magic would be formed immediately. Suspicious. However,
although it could only mean that
he was secretly practicing the forbidden necromancy and turning himself into an undead before he died,
right sleeve
it was enough to
exploded,
attract my attention, and a bloody line appeared on her fair arm. She gritted her teeth and groaned, quickly withdrawing her hand to protect the priestess in her arms, but blood was already gushing out. The warm, sparkling liquid flowed like a stream onto Hipamra's face. "Senior, take her back to the cellar. All of you, leave," Brando immediately ordered. He had previously fought with Haku 4 times, and every time he used his sword, he completely blocked the latter's attack. He had the upper hand in swordsmanship, but Haku's strength was too terrifying. He faintly felt that he could not hold his sword, and his right hand was starting to feel numb. Allium Japonicum knew that this level of battle was not something she could participate in. If she stayed, she would only restrict Brando's movements. She nodded at Brando, and decisively carried the unconscious Hipamra out of the hole. At this moment, the golden flames in Haku's eyes had been completely replaced by black flames, and half of her body was covered with a layer of black patterns. Her long hair fluttered without wind, like rising flames. It was obvious that she had been completely eroded by the power of the Book of Mavakart. She was originally a supreme powerhouse, and her control of the power of the Book of Mavakart was far superior to that of the Trashamon. After completely absorbing the power of this ancient evil, her actual realm had faintly touched the edge of the Sage realm. However, this power came with a price. Brando knew that Haku's body was already exhausted, and at this moment, she was completely burning her soul in exchange for the power of the evil. Once her soul was completely burned, she would forever lose her self-awareness and be controlled by the Book of Mavakart. She would become a lunatic like Amon. Brando could not understand. What did the blood of the Dark God mean to this woman? How could it make such a calm person act like a lunatic? However, Haku did not seem to have the mood to talk nonsense. She coldly raised her scythe and slashed at him. Brando had no choice but to raise his sword to block. At the same time, he activated his innate talent, Frenzy. Although the power of the evil was short-lived, if he did not use all his strength, he would be killed on the spot before Haku's soul was completely burned. Although he had once killed Marietla, the Witch of Lies, who was also a supreme powerhouse, it was only through trickery. Marietla's line of witches could create terrifying realistic dreamscapes. In the dreamscapes, they were like gods, and their words were law. However, once the dreamscapes were destroyed, they were no different from mortals. They were even far inferior to the average elemental powerhouse. Although Marietla was full of confidence, she did not know that her archenemy, Ko Hua, had already seen through their weaknesses. Moreover, this generation of witches was far inferior to their ancestors during the Battle of Dusk. Hence, they had been plotted against by Ko Hua and died for no reason at Brando's hands. However, Haku was different. If one did not consider her schemes, she was a genuine supreme powerhouse. In a direct confrontation, she did not even need the Book of Mavakart to firmly suppress Brando. Moreover, with the support of this ancient evil, her current strength had even surpassed Mephisto's. Brando knew that if he did not use all his strength at the first opportunity, he would not have the chance to do so. When the swords clashed, the entire space produced a sharp noise that made one's teeth ache. It sounded like glass shattering, and bright cracks appeared in the flat space. The cracks extended in all directions, and the surrounding marble pillars shattered. On the north side of the hall, there was a statue of the sun god Perkin. Perkin was holding a flaming spear and was riding a sun horse and chariot. He raised his eyes and looked forward. Then, the head of the stone statue suddenly rolled off its body. The arm that was raised high was broken, and the body was torn apart into a pile of rubble. After the statue collapsed, an obvious crack appeared at the back of the hall. The underground round hall finally could not withstand the pressure and collapsed. First, cracks that looked like spider webs appeared on the dome. A large amount of gravel rolled down, and then large pieces of rocks fell. Finally, the entire dome collapsed and caved in. For ordinary people, this kind of underground collapse was tantamount to a disaster, but for the rest of the people in the hall, it was not a problem. Brando took a few steps back under Bai's attack. He was shocked to find that Bai's power was still increasing. Even with his frenzy talent, he could not withstand Bai's attack. He faintly felt a little stuffy in his chest. He was completely defeated in a head-on confrontation. This was the first time he had been defeated in the state of frenzy. Even when he faced Sabers, Corfa, and Milos in the Great Glacier, he had never been so embarrassed. Before Brando could stand firm, he saw an undetectable black line in front of him. It separated the falling gravel and came to him. The black line was near and far. It was the blade of Bai's giant scythe. The black line seemed to be able to attract all attention in the space. Brando actually saw the tough silver line begin to break under this attack. It caused the order in this small area to be distorted, forming a black hole that swallowed everything. This was definitely a power that surpassed the limits, and it did not belong to any known law. This was the power of dusk. There was no doubt that Bai had burned her 2 elements, so she obtained this power from the Book of Mavicart. It was no longer a law, because it included the law itself. It was the truth of the universe, one of the powers of existence. It was only a flash of brilliance, but it was enough to dazzle everyone. Brando felt that all the questions in his previous life and this life had been answered at this moment. However, the price of this answer was death. This moment was unavoidable. My lord. Mephistopheles felt his hair stand on end at that moment. Without thinking, he spread out a pair of black membrane wings and shot towards Bai. The black sword in his hand burned with a raging fire, and the soul element condensed around him. He actually touched the power of the element manifestation in an instant. However, Bai only looked at the crossdresser coldly. A black light spread out from the Book of Mavicart. Before Mephistopheles could react, the black light had already swept across his lower body. The soul shield shattered after a moment. The crossdresser screamed and rolled down, covered in blood, and fell heavily to the ground. A black shadow landed beside him. It was the vampire princess, Andrea. There was a long streak of blood on Andrea's cheek. She looked up at Bai with hatred, but did not say anything. She picked up Morpheus, who was almost broken into pieces, and retreated. In the blink of an eye, she disappeared from the entrance of the underground round hole. In just a moment, the place where Enrich was standing was buried by the collapsed hole. The underground hall was now history. Brando threw away the Halran Gaia. At this level, swordsmanship was meaningless. Although his swordsmanship was close to the Tao, it was still too far away. This was the dialogue between the highest level elements. Only the elements could fight against the elements. Countless lines of law appeared around him at the same time. They intertwined with each other, weaving the most basic and primitive language of this world. Time and space had lost their meaning in this world. They were described as formulas, and these formulas were eternal. Energy and matter appeared at the 2 ends of the scale. They changed and transformed each other, and all laws and karma appeared. The past and the future seemed to overlap each other, and they could reach each other. These things that ordinary people could not understand were harmonious and unified in this world. They were one and the same. It was as if as long as one understood one of them, one would understand the mystery of the whole world. Brando saw a spreading energy. It appeared to be a dazzling black in this pure silver world. As this energy moved forward, the laws changed. Its disorder seemed to be increasing at every moment, affecting everything in the blink of an eye. But Brando immediately found the 2 strings of time and space. These 2 strings ran through the whole world, forming a perfect circle. When he touched these 2 strings, the energy he was in immediately spread out. It was as if it was everywhere in this world. Present and future, past and present. He could be at any point, and he could be at any position. Brando used all his strength to avoid the dazzling black. The whole world seemed to resonate at that moment, but he soon found that his actions were in vain. All the laws began to collapse, and the countless possibilities he was in collapsed into one point. And he was at that final position. A black wave rushed towards him. There was no way to evade. But suddenly, a figure blocked in front of him. Brando narrowed his eyes and found that it was the tall body of the undead Lori-san. It raised the huge sword, and with a loud bang, an irresistible force came through the body of the skeleton knight. Both of them flew back at the same time and fell heavily into the collapsed walls. Then they were buried by the sand, and the whole world fell into darkness. Brando coughed, and his thoughts paused for a moment. But he quickly recovered and shot out from the thick soil like a cannonball, landing on the ground again. He shook off the sand on his body and found that the battlefield outside had completely changed. The familiar underground hall was gone, and only a deep pit was left. The sunlight gathered from all directions, and he could not help but squint his eyes. The undead knight Lori-san stood at the corner of him. It was not in a better state than him. Its sword was half broken, its cloak was torn, and dust was everywhere. There was a deep wound on its chest, and several of its snow-white ribs were broken. The dancing soul fire was completely exposed. The two of them looked up at the sky at the same time. There, Haku's mind was almost completely controlled by the Book of Mavakart. She was bathed in endless black flames and turned into a flaming person, as if she would burn out at any time. The only thing left was her pair of incomparably determined eyes, as if there was an endless obsession supporting her, allowing her to fall into the abyss, but still retain a trace of clarity. Her eyes were fixed on the black cocoon of light in the air. She stretched out her hand, and the ribbon of light wrapped around the black cocoon of light flew to her, bringing with it a majestic power. This power made even Brando's heart palpitate. It was the power of the blood of the god of darkness. When the power of the Black Pearl was fully released, it was extremely shocking. However, although Brando and Lori-san wanted to seize it, they found that they could not move at all. The Book of Mavakart on Haku's head was emitting an endless pressure that far exceeded the limits of her control. Her burning soul was like a bright star that was moving towards the end of its life, ending everything in a burst of magnificent energy. In comparison, Amon, who used to control the projection of the ancient evil creature, was like a child waving a toy. This was the power of the divine. Brando felt his heart beating powerfully. Not far from him, Lori-san's soul was roaring furiously, but it was useless. The blood of the god of darkness was rushing towards Haku, and Haku persisted in completing this sacred ritual. Whether she was about to die or completely controlled by the evil creature, it was as if it had nothing to do with her. To her, everything in front of her was the entire world. Brando tried his best to shift his gaze, and he finally noticed something out of place. It was a stone slab floating in the air. It was alone in that position, but it completely ignored all forms of energy around it. There's still one more chance. Brando gritted his teeth as he thought. He took a deep breath and shouted with all his strength, Medisha. In an instant, a door of light appeared on the battlefield. Chapter 10:17. Before Medisha appeared, a beam of silver light shot out from the light door and hit the war slate in the middle of the air with a crisp clang. It then turned to one side and shot into the ground. Only then did everyone see that the silver line was a silver shuttle-shaped spear, which was inserted into the collapsed stone wall at an angle. The war slate that was hit flew in the opposite direction and rolled in the sand beside Brando's feet. Brando chanted, "In the name of knowledge and wisdom, activate." The center of the war slate spun inwards and a beam of white light shot out from it and flowed into the patterns on the war slate. The entire war slate shone and then flew up again and stopped in front of Brando. "Get out of my way." But it was at this moment that Haku roared. A black belt of light swept across and hit the war slate, sending it flying like a cannonball to the ground. It then bounced up high and flew in the direction of the forest in the distance. However, the majestic power of dusk from the Book of Mavakar activated the war slate's defense system in an instant. As the war slate spun in the air, countless pure white light beams shot out from the patterns. The light beams directly pierced through the overlapping black belt of light. One beam pierced through Haku's waist and the other pierced through her chest. Haku screamed and fell straight to the ground. Her body was covered in black flames as if she was going to be burned to ashes in an instant. The remaining light beams shot into the air, the ground, and the direction of the forest. Everywhere they passed, it was like a beehive. Once the light beams hit the trees, they immediately burst into flames and turned into white ashes in the blink of an eye. The war slate that had lost its light rolled into the forest not far away. Less than 5 meters away from where it landed, a rock was suddenly lifted from below. Allium Japonicum carried Hippamra, who was covered in blood, out of the secret passage. She could smell the burning smell of the battlefield outside and could not help but frown. But just as she raised her head, a bright light reflected in her eyes. Bookshelf number, Arcane 105223031V, Armor, Initials D, Implantation Technology, Inheritance of War Equipment, Inheritor, Iron Bloodline, Bloodline Match. Inheritance begins, from, Earth Legion. At the moment when the white light disappeared, Brando and the undead knight Lori-san immediately felt the pressure on them loosen. "It's done, now." Brando did not have time to retrieve his Halran Gaia. He directly activated his elemental power and flashed in the direction where Haku fell. Lori-san was a little slower, but he followed closely behind him. The two of them arrived at the edge of the deep pit where Haku fell, but found no one there. Brando's heart skipped a beat. A claw burning with black flames had already reached out from the side. Without thinking, he raised his fist to block it. With a muffled bang, Brando only felt a piercing pain from his arm. Haku was not going to let Brando go. She threw punch after punch. In an instant, she and Brando had exchanged 30 to 40 blows. In terms of swordsmanship, Brando was far superior to this woman. However, when it came to close combat, he was too far behind. Not to mention that Haku had now mastered the power of the Book of Mavakart. After 30 to 40 punches, Brando only felt his arms go numb. It was as if he could no longer feel his arms. At this time, he caught a glimpse of a black light sweeping towards him from the corner of his eye, but there was no way he could dodge it. Medisha, who was dressed in silver, stepped out of the portal. However, she immediately felt darkness in front of her. A black shadow had flown back from the front and crashed into her. She groaned and immediately felt that the person in her arms was her lord. At the same time, the light door behind her shattered and disappeared. She hurriedly hugged Brando with one hand and took a step back. At the same time, she raised her right hand. The silver spear that was stabbed into the ground not far away instantly turned into thousands of light particles and disappeared. It then reappeared in her hand. 1,000 army strike. Medisha threw the spear forward with all her might. A silver line flew across half of the battlefield and shot towards Haku. Haku turned around and glanced coldly. A series of black ribbons of light rose from the ground and weaved together to form an arc-shaped light shield. The spear hit the light shield hard and only created a trail of golden sparks. On the other hand, the spot where the spear hit the light shield reflected a ray of black light at 10 times the speed. Medisha did not even have time to react before her chest was pierced. She widened her eyes in disbelief and spat out a mouthful of blood. Brando woke up from his temporary coma. He felt that it was raining on his forehead. He subconsciously reached out and wiped his forehead. The thick smell of blood made him realize that something was wrong. He suddenly woke up and remembered that he was still on the battlefield. He opened his eyes and saw Medicia's pale and weak face. The elven princess's mouth was full of blood and there were layers of black circles around her eyes. She covered him with her hands as if she wanted to smile at him, but the pain twisted her smile into an expression that was uglier than crying. Medicia. Brando felt that his heart was about to stop beating. He looked down and saw the black hole on her chest. Her silver robe was stained red and it was a ghastly sight. His mind almost went blank for a moment. Medicia and the Shire no longer had the ability to be resurrected from the graveyard after becoming planeswalkers. If she died here, then the pure and kind Silver Elf Princess would truly disappear from this world. I cough. I'm fine, my lord. Medicia seemed to read the deep fear in Brando's eyes. The woman was just an arrow at the end of its flight. As long as she could hold on for a while longer, the outcome of the battle would still be uncertain. He patted Medicia's shoulder and said gently, "Stay away, Medicia." After that, his body flashed and appeared in front of Hale. "My lord." The Silver Elf Princess's knees went soft and she knelt on the ground as if she was a puppet. Hale had only stretched out her hand halfway when she saw Brando reappearing in front of her. Her eyes were filled with anger. "You're courting death, human." Brando did not say a word. The anger in his eyes was not inferior to Hale's. If it was said that the battle before was a battle of interests, but at this moment, it was destined that only one of them could survive. As soon as he appeared, he attacked with all his might. He activated Charge and the Crown of Thorns. He completely abandoned his defense and his attack was boosted to the limit. He turned into a meteor and crashed into Hale, who was in midair. Hale did not intend to talk too much nonsense with Brando. She knew that she did not have much time left. She coldly glanced at Brando. Dozens of black energy beams rose from behind her and shot toward Brando. At this moment, she did not even care about the undead knight Lori-san. She was not afraid of a mere elemental truth human. There was only one thing left in her eyes, the blood of the Dark God. But she soon realized a problem. Countless black light beams instantly pierced through Brando's body. His clothes and armor were completely torn apart. Even the behemoth's grip was shattered inch by inch under the powerful power of the Sage Domain. Fragments of his bones, organs, and blood flew all over the sky along with the energy beams, turning him into a bloody man in an instant. But no matter how dense and terrifying the attacks were, he continued to move forward without dodging. He was like the god of war described in the legends who had the strength to fight against 10,000 soldiers. When he moved forward, the gods and ghosts would avoid him. A bloody path was naturally formed. Brando covered his heart with one hand. His long hair danced like wild grass. He raised his head. His bloodied face was like a ferocious ghost, but he was smiling. His snow-white teeth gleamed with a cold light. Unyielding. At this moment, Hale realized that she could not stop all of this. Golden bloodline, perfect body. A thought that made her extremely terrified arose in her heart. Brando had already grabbed her wrist. Hale actually forgot to react for a moment. Then, a fist became bigger and bigger in her vision. Bang! Hale screamed. She was almost sent flying by Brando's punch. But she could not fly away because one of her hands was still tightly clamped by him. She finally caught her breath with great difficulty. Brando's second punch was already in front of her. This time, Hale finally remembered what she should do. She screamed and threw a punch at Brando. Brando did not dodge. The two fists collided heavily. With a loud bang, Brando's right hand suddenly became completely distorted and fell limply to the ground. However, Brando's attack power with the Crown of Thorns fully activated was not to be underestimated. Hale screamed as well. Her right hand made a series of crisp cracking sounds, and then she could no longer raise it. No matter what, Hale was still a woman. This time, she was in so much pain that she almost fainted. She could not help but gasp. But what she did not expect was that the damned human actually used his remaining hand to hug her tightly and pushed her away from the Book of Mavacart. "You deserve to die." Hale immediately realized what he wanted to do. She endured the pain and extended the last few light ribbons. They wrapped around the blood of the dark god in mid-air and threw it in her direction. At the next moment, the Book of Mavacart in mid-air finally lost its last bit of power. It flickered twice and disappeared into the air. At this time, the two of them were completely powerless. They hugged each other and fell to the ground like meteors. Hale's soul had already begun to dissipate, leaving only the burning obsession in her eyes. She stared at the black ball of light that followed closely behind. She knew that there was only one step left in her ritual. Once she obtained the blood of the dark god, she still had hope of turning the tables. However, under her horrified gaze, she saw the black ball of light enter Brendel's body without hesitation, like a river returning to the sea. She could even feel the excitement and joy coming from the blood of the dark god. My ritual. Hale seemed to have seen the most impossible ending. You have the blood of the dark god in your body. Brando was already unconscious. Chapter 10:19. The bell of dusk rang in the sky above Nibosia City. The sound of the bell echoed in the empty twilight. Near and far, the setting sun shone through the fiery glow of the sunset onto the dome of the Golden Palace, reflecting an orange-red glow. Teams of golden-armored Praetorian guards lined up on the slope outside the palace walls to change shifts. From afar, the uniform commands of the ceremonial knight could be heard. The noise passed through the copper-plated treetops and even into the inner court. In the winter solstice palace, Pope Pétien III hurriedly finished his dinner. Half a carefully cooked roasted lamb, a silver sea crab, and exquisite pastries were all served on a snow-white porcelain plate. The meat dishes were made with basil leaves and snow tree leaves from Saint-Ossol. The surface was covered with sauce and black pepper. The meat was tender and fragrant, but the diner himself had no appetite. After tasting it, he put down the silver knife and fork and wiped his mouth with a square handkerchief embroidered with golden silk. Only then did he order the attendants to arrange a carriage for him to go to the Emerald Hall. Fanzin's religious authority was unified. Although the nobles would still have grudges against the Holy Cathedral because of the unequal distribution of benefits, from the secular power upwards, the secular laurels and the Holy Scepter were all in the hands of one person. Because of this, the election of the Pope was often not hereditary. Usually, it was chosen from the 8 cardinals. After the abdication of the previous Pope, he took the title of saint and lived in the Emerald Hall. He did not ask for secular power, but he was still the spiritual leader of the Holy Church. Therefore, for thousands of years, this empty position also had great power. Today, although the current Pope could make arbitrary decisions, he was still subject to the restrictions of the Pope. These days, Pétien III's uneasiness stemmed from this. He sat in the carriage and looked at the shadow of the Emerald Hall from afar. It was like a giant beast entrenched in his heart, eyeing him covetously, making him uneasy. The former Pope, Escapades XI, was his mentor on the Holy Road. He had trained him to where he was today. Although the teacher-student relationship was harmonious, they were always separated by a throne. Pétien knew that this was due to their respective positions. All the previous popes were like this, and it was understandable. He had always advocated a holy war against Cruz in the south. Escapades XI had always known his thoughts. Now that the people of Cruz were in chaos without a fight, and that crazy queen dared to restore the dark reign, this was a heaven-sent opportunity for him to fight against Cruz. He had even contacted the Wind Elves and the envoys of the Grecius Knight Order, and had stockpiled troops and provisions at the border, preparing for a grand plan to leave a mark in history. But at this time, an edict of ceasefire had dashed his hopes. This edict came from the emerald gold sacred hall in front of him. This kind of thing might not happen even once in 100 years. The last time it happened was during the time of the Rimador Rebellion, when Gloria I used the power of the Holy Knight Order to remove the reigning pope from his position. This association made Petyen III's face gloomy. He looked gloomily at the 7-foot-high golden palace gate of the emerald sacred hall that was slowly opened by the guards on both sides. No one knew what kind of thoughts were running through his mind. The deeper uneasiness in his heart came from the reactions of the bishops. The bishops and the Knight Order did not seem to react as fiercely as he had expected. The interior of the empire was as calm as a mirror, without the slightest ripple. He knew that the old man behind the palace gate must have used some unknown power to make all parties submit to him respectfully. As a superior, he could not tolerate power that was not in his grasp, especially when this power was so great that it was beyond his expectations. Accompanied by his attendants, Petyen III walked through the corridor and stopped in front of a dark walnut door. He then raised his hand to dismiss his attendants and at the same time, stopped his servants from announcing his arrival. Facing this walnut door, the supreme ruler of the Holy Inquisition found a trace of hesitation in his heart. But this trace of hesitation was as light and weak as a spider's web. His Holiness the Pope broke free with a light struggle, put his slender palm on the doorknob, and pushed the door open. Since old age, Acebanto XI liked to light the fireplace in his study, sit on a low chair, and read the scriptures and documents of the Church all day long. Although Petyen III doubted how much true meaning there was in it, he was more or less envious. Since he had taken control of the secular power, he inevitably alienated the divine will. The Holy See is inferior to the ascetics. This proverb was not a rumor in Fanzin. A warm breath hit his face, and the hot wind hit his cheeks. He could not help but squint his eyes. The flickering fire in the fireplace seemed to flow through the gap of the door. It was like a flowing warmth, flowing over his golden shoes and the end of his holy robe. Acebanto XI was not alone in the room. In addition to a servant in his 40s, there was also an old man with white hair and a white beard and glasses. Petyen III recognized this man at a glance. He was a famous scripture scholar in the holy sanctum. Acebanto XI was still wearing a plain robe today, but he wore a hat, which was rare. He looked quite formal and serious. Sitting opposite him was a woman. Petyen III was a little surprised and could not help but take another look at the woman. But after another look, he could not take his eyes off her. The woman had long, dry brown hair and a pair of eyes that shone like jade embedded in a mountain rock. The reason it was called embedded in a mountain rock was because her skin looked extremely dry and dull. Her cheekbones were high, like steep rocks. Her lips were sharp and angular, as if they were carved out of them. It was obvious at a glance that this woman had an extremely firm character. There was only one woman in the world who had such a face, and only one woman who had a lifespan of 1,000 years. Petyen respectfully greeted, "Your Excellency." Acebanto XI looked at his student with a smile as he closed the book in his hand. It was a scripture that described the early teachings of the Holy Sanctum. The person who recorded it was buried under the soil about 300 or 400 years ago, although he was posthumously canonized as a saint after his death. He waved his hand, indicating that Petyen did not need to be so courteous. It was as if he had already foreseen that the Pope would come. "Your Excellency, are you here today because you have a lot of questions?" The situation was out of Petyen's control. The current Pope pondered for a moment and nodded solemnly. "Let me answer you," Iranta the sage said. Her voice was unexpectedly soft and pleasant, completely unlike her face. "I asked His Excellency Asabanto to issue that edict." "Why?" Pet Yen 3 asked. "Because I hope that Fanzan will not participate in this war, Your Excellency." "Why?" Pet Yen still asked the same question. Asabanto 11 continued with a smile, "Your Excellency, for half a century, the holy sanctum has been in turmoil, and the old and new doctrines have been in dispute. You have seen all of this with your own eyes. The reason for this is nothing more than to discuss the issue of justice. The root of this problem is the Great War 60 years ago. We saw many things behind the scenes of that war, so much so that we began to question the foundation of our existence. What do you think of this?" Pet Yen did not answer. Instead, he glanced at Iranta. "I can't give you an answer to who is right and who is wrong in history, Your Excellency." Iranta calmly replied, "Although I have experienced it myself, Gil, Saint Tossol, and your predecessor Fanzan can't answer this question. Odin believes that he is wrong, but this only represents his own opinion. He can't judge history and everything in the past. In a certain period of history we are in, no one can judge himself correctly, not to mention there were countless sages before him. Many people were involved in it. Anyone in this part of history, whether it is a person who experienced it or a bystander, can only observe a fragment of it, so we can only experience it ourselves and witness it. I have lived for 1,000 years just to see the result with my own eyes." Pet Yen 3 frowned. "But do you think that the Queen of the Cruise people has made the right choice?" Iranta shook her head. "No, it is because we can't be sure whether we are right or wrong that I want to see another path in history. You know the prophecy, the lost moon takes away the light is lost, the silver generation is lost to the earth, walking forward in the darkness and obscurity, the chance encounter between the emperor and the fool, the rusty clockwork is being restored, the sword that changes fate, Wond is waiting for this sword that changes fate. Do you believe in the dark prophecy, sage?" Pet Yen 3 asked, "Everything will be born from the darkness. This is what the Myrna people are unwilling to give up, Your Excellency," the sage replied. "This is the age of black iron, the age of heroes. Martha gave power to the mortals, believing that heroes will be born from the mortals. But in the eyes of the gold and silver race, how can the weak save our world? What's more, there is the failed work of being lost in the dark forest. Everything seems to be a warning to civilization that this is a wrong path. The descendants of the Azure Knight quarreled endlessly over this, and the fire of civilization declined day by day, to the point that it could not continue. The Dark Dragon Odin made a last resort choice to save all of this, and today will be the time for it to show the results." Iranta looked at Pet Yen 3 and replied, "The millennium of history seems to have returned to a cycle, but this may not be the beginning and starting point of everything. I will observe the agreement with Odin to witness the end, but in any case, I still hope to preserve a little fire for civilization, and not pour all of our power into just one answer. Therefore, I hope that the people of Fanzan can leave this mortal stage, because there is a more important war that needs your strength." Pet Yen 3 raised his head slightly. "Sage, what do you mean?" Iranta raised her head, and her emerald eyes seemed to be able to penetrate the palace walls of the Emerald Hall. In the direction she looked, across the vast hills and plains, under the fiery clouds, the waves of the Emerald Sea tirelessly washed the towering white cliffs for thousands of years. On this vast land, the alliance known as the 10 Cities took root and multiplied. About 530 years ago, mercenaries and merchants from the Aenir and Make-Sun regions came here and spent 100 years to build the first city here. After half a century, a new kingdom was established. Its people were humans, mountain people, elves, and dwarves. The teachings of the Templar were widely spread here, but the faith of nature was not rejected by the people. This was a paradise of freedom, where money and the sound of swords echoed each other all year round. But today, under the White City, the fishermen who went out to sea suddenly stopped their work. Some of the sailors were cleaning the nets and ropes, some were still climbing on the masts, some were drunk and had just walked out of the cabin onto the deck, some were raising the sails, and some were raising the anchor by the capstan. But all of them stopped and looked back in the direction of the sea and the sky. The turrets on the city wall were firing warning shots, and groups of guards swarmed onto the city wall. The sea was blue, and the intersection between the sea and the sky was calm, as if nothing unusual had happened. But in the blink of an eye, dense black dots appeared in that direction. Rand hastily put on a suit of armor and hurried to the top of the city wall. His squires escorted him to the edge of the battlements. He raised his hand to stop the noise around him, and then raised the monocular in his hand. What he saw was a white triangular sail, and it almost blinded his eyes. He cursed under his breath and looked down. The silver oak emblem on the sail shone in the sun, and then he saw the elegant white hull of the elves. The fleet of the wild elves. Rand sighed and put down the monocular. There are at least 300 ships, and this is an army of 30,000 people. Is Eloranta crazy? The Eloranta he mentioned was naturally referring to the kingdom of the wild elves. He took another look to be sure that he was not hallucinating. At this time, the alarm bells in the White City were already ringing, and the ships outside began to file into the harbor. Rand glanced at the harbor and estimated that the harbor would be closed in about half an hour. He looked back. He was just a small captain, and he could not make any decisions on this matter. He handed the monocular to his deputy, and then said to a squire, "Go and inform the faraway eagle and the city lord, and let them decide. If the elves are serious, White City will not be able to hold. We must immediately seek support from other cities." The retainer glanced at him in panic before trembling as he took the brass token and stumbled down the stairs. "Look at that ship!" Suddenly, a squire pointed in the direction of the sea and shouted. Rand looked back and saw a light boat coming out of the Wild Elves' fleet and approaching White City at an extremely fast speed. "It's a messenger. They sent a messenger. What do the elves want? P.S. A new month has begun. Everyone, keep up the good work." Chapter 10:20. Brendel felt as if he had just experienced a long dream. The dream was made up of countless fragmented images. The images flashed before his eyes one by one, like a silent river. As time passed, he experienced one world after another in a trance. In the first world, he was half awake and half asleep. There were many tall and handsome humans standing in the room. They had black hair and golden eyes. They were wearing robes. The robes were red on the left and black on the right. There was a dark golden collar at the neckline. There was an Ouroboros on the robes. There were 11 of them in total. One of them stepped forward and reached out to touch his eyelids. The ring of coiled serpent on his index finger was shining with silver light. The first thing he saw was the dark walls and floor, which were covered with a lattice network used to transmit magic power. It looked like the upper level of a tower. Outside the round hall were 12 black stone pillars. Outside the pillars were a sea of golden clouds. Towering buildings stood in the middle of the sea of clouds. In the distance, the Perkins sun emitted an eternal afterglow on the horizon. Those handsome humans were talking to each other, but they did not make any sound. It was like a silent movie. Occasionally, they would draw a bright symbol in the air, and then the others would nod as if they agreed. From the mouths of these people, Brando finally distinguished a word that he could understand in modern cruise language. The Truth Society. The picture quickly became fragmented and dimmed. In the second world, Brando felt that he had become an exiled refugee. The beautiful buildings around him were no longer there. He was in a daze, following an unknown clan. Giant beasts were pulling wooden carts on the Great Plains. Looking back, the sky was still covered with golden clouds. He could vaguely see the shadow of a tall tower on the clouds. And above the sky, countless meteorites were falling from the sky, dragging long flames behind them. They hit the ground obliquely, leaving a flash on the horizon. But there was only one image that left a deep impression on him. A huge dragon shrouded half the sky, spreading its wings from the south of the Great Plains all the way to the north, crossing the horizon. Its curved neck was like a huge tower on top of the clouds. Its huge head stared at the ground, its golden eyes shining. It was like a huge shadow in the clouds, dominating the entire sky and earth. However, a ray of emerald green light was rising from behind the clouds. It was like a star, shining brightly in the sky, pointing directly at the dragon's heart. Then, the second image disappeared like sand in the wind. Then came the third world, which was made up of a series of broken images. Sometimes, he felt that he was being carried by a group of people in black robes through mountains covered by dark clouds. Sometimes, he felt that he was worshipping an altar towering under the golden sun with countless believers. On the altar stood a giant surrounded by lightning. Then, he saw a human in a red robe injecting a flaming bead into the body of a monster. The monster's wail shook the heavens and the earth. He saw countless such monsters being created. Most of them were killed immediately, but a small number of them escaped into the forest and became monsters. The ones that survived were some black-haired, golden-eyed creatures that resembled humans. Then the image dimmed again. At that moment, Brando suddenly understood that this was the process of the birth of the Myrnas. Some people were trying to use the blood of God to recreate the divine people, and they were the derivatives of this experiment. After understanding this, his mind fell into a deep sleep. This sleep seemed to have taken a century. When Brando woke up again, he had not opened his eyes, but he had already smelled the faint fragrance of flowers in the wind. When he opened his eyes, he was already in an exquisite courtyard. The courtyard was like a dream, with evergreen spring, nightingales singing softly, and ivory-white carved pillars hidden in the shade of the trees. Elven guards with silver halberds in their hands stood at the left and right. Surrounded by the crowd, a silver-haired elven girl lifted her skirt and came to his side. She bowed to him and said, "Good afternoon, royal sister." Brando was stunned for a moment, and these images dissipated like sand in the wind. Then he heard an angry voice. "How dare you pry into my memory?" This sentence was like tearing a hole in the entire dream, causing the world of the dream to be completely fragmented, and it woke Brando up abruptly. He opened his eyes. The first thing that came into his sight was a verdant green, with fragmented golden light floating slightly in the green field. When he saw it a little more clearly, Brando found that it was the shade of a tree that swayed slightly in the afternoon. Then came into view was a short-haired woman with a cold expression. She was holding her hand on his forehead, slightly frowning, and her short platinum hair was shining under the sun. Seeing that Brando had woken up, the woman's furrowed brows relaxed, and the tip of her eyebrows even raised a little. This subtle movement made Brando realize that the other party knew him. "You saved me." "Ah." Brando groaned. Just as he was about to move, he felt an endless pain coming from his limbs and bones. He remembered everything that had happened before. He remembered the fierce battle with White. He remembered that he was seriously injured in the state of unyielding, and the blood of the dark god rampaged through his body and caused further damage. It could only be said to be a miracle that he was still alive. But there were no miracles in this world, so the only possibility was the woman in front of him. After a brief confusion, he had actually recognized the identity of the other party. The Holy Maiden of the Lion Palace, Sydney. But why was she in this place? Sydney silently pressed her hand on Brando and said, "Your injuries are too serious. The holy water can only barely pull you back from the hands of the Grim Reaper, and there is no way to heal your external injuries." Only then did Brando understand his current state. He silently lay down for a moment, his mind in a mess. It took him a while to sort out his thoughts, so he sat up from the ground with some difficulty and took out the holy water from the dimensional space to drink. Feeling that the injuries in his body were gradually recovering under the infusion of the holy energy, Brando had time to weakly open his character attribute panel. Then he was stunned by his current state. Under the character status column, the line of absolute strength clearly wrote Elemental Enlightenment, Peak. He immediately felt his own strength. Under the stability of his elemental power, there were hidden turbulent waves, but the lines of law that made up his elemental power were more stable and unbreakable than before. The two laws related to time and space appeared clearly around his body, and there was no longer a feeling of obscurity like before. This was an important characteristic of the elemental enlightenment stage. From the realm of elemental enlightenment to the realm of elemental enlightenment, it was the process of mastering and understanding power. The higher the realm of elemental enlightenment, the deeper and clearer the understanding of one's own elemental power. When one reached the peak of elemental enlightenment, the elemental power of an elemental master was no longer just a passive law. At this stage, the elemental power did not have only a few active and passive skills. Players could truly rely on their own will to manipulate and understand the elemental power, and the power of the elemental power, other than the limitations of its own nature, was only dependent on the level of understanding and control of the elemental power. In fact, this was already the threshold to the peak of elemental power, and also the foundation of ultimate power. After going through this stage, players could truly grasp the power of the elemental power. Brando looked down and saw that in addition to the original active and passive skills, there was an additional active effect. Players will be able to freely manipulate the power of time and space. Of course, this way of displaying the power of the elemental power was the same as the active skills of the elemental power. It required a continuous consumption of order power, which was the so-called degree of control and control of the elemental power. The consumption was very shocking, but the shocking consumption also brought about powerful effects. Just like before, the active and passive effects of the elemental power that Brando could use were only limited to teleportation, limited manipulation of the flow of time, and increasing his own defense. So when Whitehair attacked, he could only rely on teleportation to escape, and was easily suppressed by his opponent. But now, it was different. Brando could now easily be immune to all damage. He only needed to isolate either space or time, and as long as the psionic elemental power or the power of dusk could not negate this condition, then limited invincibility would be established. And this was the reason why the elemental power, which was similar to the power of existence, was so powerful. Wond was a world of elemental power, and the more powerful the elemental power one controlled, the higher the position one could reach. This was not empty talk. Of course, with Brando's current strength, if he wanted to do this, he could only maintain it for 1,000th of a second. After all, theory and reality were not always the same. Brando clenched his fist as if he was feeling his own strength. He vaguely understood the reason why his strength jumped from the middle level of the elemental enlightenment to the peak of the elemental enlightenment. In fact, after seeing White's stunning sickle, he faintly felt that he had touched the threshold of something that even he could not understand in his previous life. It was the deepest mystery of this world, and White's supreme power contained the aura of the power of existence, which answered all the questions in his heart. In this world, there were very few existential powers, but chaos was definitely one of them. Brando could not help but feel lucky because in Wond, the powerful elemental power did not come without a price. This was because the more powerful the elemental power, the more difficult it was for mortals to grasp and understand the truth and secrets behind it. For example, an elemental power of the level of time and space was extremely complicated. Mortals might not be able to understand its true meaning in their lifetime, let alone master it. Those who had the highest level of elemental power might not be able to truly awaken their elemental power in the end, and those who could awaken their elemental power might not be able to understand the true meaning of elemental power in the end. Those who had lower level elemental power would have a great advantage in this aspect. For example, someone as talented as Greysword Saint Mephistopheles had to rely on coincidence to awaken the extreme planes. What he had mastered was just a grey elemental power. Although it was a fantasy elemental power, its level was not high. It had to be said that Brando himself was extremely lucky. Awakening his elemental power and reaching the peak of elemental power of truth all relied on extremely coincidental circumstances. He had some confidence in awakening his elemental power, but he really had no confidence in entering the extreme planes with time and space elemental power. After all, it was very likely to be the existence of existential power. But he did not expect Haku to personally demonstrate in front of him the form of existential power in Wound. Of course, if he had died under that scythe, then the series of results that followed would naturally not have existed. But he had escaped, so everything that he saw at that time had now blossomed. Looking past the elemental power, Brando was not satisfied. He faintly felt that the changes in his body did not stop there. The first thing he needed to find was the blood of the Dark God. Haku was so obsessed with that thing, which meant that it was not as simple as it appeared to be. Moreover, although he understood the form of existence of time and space elemental power, the accumulation of his own absolute power had to follow a step-by-step process. It was absolutely impossible to gain power out of thin air. And this part of the increase in power, Brando suspected that it came from the blood of the Dark God. His gaze quickly focused, and he found that he had found the root of the problem. Although he didn't find any traces of the Dark God's blood in his attribute panel, he found another thing. He found that his elite template had been directly upgraded to a leader template. Moreover, it was the highest level world leader template. This template directly increased his attributes by 150%. With these attributes, he had steadily entered the peak of the elemental enlightenment in terms of absolute attributes. Brando suddenly understood the problem with the level of his absolute power that was marked on his character status before. If it was only an increase in his understanding of the elemental power, then it would only increase the strength of his control over the elemental power itself. And the increase in absolute power was obviously dependent on the increase in his attributes. But the elite template would not be upgraded for no reason, and the most likely thing right now was that suspicious blood of the Dark God. For some reason, when Brando thought of this, the scene that he saw in the dream suddenly appeared in his mind. In the third world, those people he saw should be the first generation of tree herders, the druids of the Ring of the World. They were creating gods. With the power of the blood of the Dark God, Brando could not help but subconsciously touch the wound on his chest. Although it had completely healed, leaving only a shallow scar, he seemed to be able to feel the power of the blood pulsing in it. Chapter 10:21. The three worlds in the dream should be arranged according to the order of time. The room he was in the first dream was probably Babel Fortress. The words recorded on the ancient parchment of the Mithril Society described the fortress as follows: it is located in the center of the four directions of heaven and earth. Clouds float above the golden clouds. On the clouds are palaces carved out of gold and jade. Silver people in long robes walk on it. Bells ring in the clouds, hymns linger. Everything matched the scene he saw in the dream perfectly. The 11 tall and handsome humans should be the divine people, but they could also be one of the golden race. Even though Babel Fortress was the city of silver, there were still golden races. Even though in this era, the only golden race left was the dragon race, but in the tens of thousands of years before Babel Fortress was destroyed, there were many golden races on the land. Most of them were buried under the dust of history, just like the ancestors buried in Valhalla. However, Brando still thought that the possibility of them being the divine people was higher. The divine people had black hair and golden eyes, which matched the description of them in the legends. Even though golden eyes were the most famous external feature of the golden race, black-haired golden race were very rare. As for the mithril people, their eyes were somewhere between amber and agate, like a golden-red flame, not a pure color. Moreover, according to what he saw in the later scenes, the mithril people and the divine people seemed to have a deep relationship. As for the Truth Society mentioned by the tall and handsome humans, it wasn't the first time Brando had heard of it. Ovina had once mentioned that his authority was Inheritance and Truth Society, but she didn't say which power this authority came from. Later, when he occasionally talked with Dark Ko-hwa, the eldest daughter of Akis inadvertently revealed some information about the Truth Society. Before the Silver Age, when Babel Fortress was destroyed, and even further back, dating back to the First and Second War with the Twilight Dragon, that was the era when the divine people still walked the land. It was a glorious era. The divine people and Martha created Wond and the gods together and ruled this world. Just like the gods in the pantheon, the divine people also belonged to several organizations. The most important of which were the Truth Society, the Tribunal, the World Tree Organization. He suspected that it was the predecessor of the Druids of the Ring of the World and the Ring of the Sky, the Earth Guard, and the Will of Gaia, which only existed in legends and had never been seen before. However, Brando couldn't tell from the scene at that time whether the Truth Society, mentioned by the tall and handsome humans, was referring to him or them. If it was the latter, then these people must be the divine people. The second world in the dream should be the destruction of Babel Fortress. During the Sixth War, the Azure Night broke through the sky and caused the stars to fall to the ground. The gigantic dragon that stretched across the sky was undoubtedly the projection of the Twilight Dragon in this world. Although it was just a glimpse in the dream, it left a deep impression on him. The golden red eyes above the clouds were so similar to the oppressive aura he saw above Fathom Harbor that day. He was almost certain that it was the will of the twilight that attracted him at that time. The destruction of Babel Fortress ended the era of the gods. Countless books and documents disappeared from this disaster, and the fragments of civilization were scattered on the earth. The Silver Generation trekked in the wilderness, and the civilization was almost completely shattered and destroyed. 10,000 years later, a prophet led the Myurnas to re-establish their empire in the Black Forest. Although the Azure Knight was the first generation of the Darkness Dragon and left a very important legacy to the Myurnas, no documents mentioned what this legacy was. Today's mainstream historians believe that the Azure Knight should be the earliest Myurnas, and that what he left behind was probably the golden bloodline of the Myurnas. In other words, long before the establishment of the Myurnas Empire, the Myurnas had already existed on the earth and wandered in the wilderness with other silver folk to rediscover the fire of civilization. This conjecture was also in line with the development and reproduction of civilization. The establishment of an empire could not be done in a day. Just like the Silver Elves and the Bugis, the Myurnas Empire also developed and grew in obscurity for countless years, and their powerful bloodline laid a solid foundation for the prosperity of their empire. That was why the Mardos stood on the land of Wond. The third world in the dream revealed some secrets to him. These memory fragments may be divided into several different eras. Walking through the cloudy mountains should have happened before the first generation of the Myurnas fled to the Great Plains. After the destruction of Babel Fortress, civilization and order fell apart. The Myurnas and the Silver Folk fled, and countless seeds of civilization were lost in the wilderness. The noble people forgot their noble and elegant past, and were lost on the earth. They hid in the mountains and forests, and after a long time, forgot everything in the past, and moved forward in obscurity and thorns. That was the passage recorded in the Pale poem. Then civilization sprouted in obscurity. He saw countless believers worshipping the altar towering under the sun. The birth of worship and superstition, the reverence for the gods walking in the sky, was in fact reverence for order. The seeds of civilization bloomed again in superstition and mystery after thousands of years. But about this history, it was an eternal mystery in the Orthodox historiography of Wond. Some documents from before the War of the Holy Saints, when describing this history, all mentioned the same word, prophet. The Myurnas appeared on the earth, and a prophet led them across the Great Plains. In the wilderness of today's four-leaf clover, they established the first civilized empire after the gods left Wound. This was the Myurnas Empire, and this was the beginning of the era of mortals. In the Silver Elves, the Bugas, and even other races that existed at that time, there was no doubt that there were similar descriptions. In the legend of the Bugas, a planeswalker, Brando thought it should be a planeswalker, because the description was very similar to the legendary Matatanians, who had the ability to travel to different worlds, was teaching mortal magic in today's Silverflash Bay. It was different from the ancient string magic used by the dragons, the predecessor of modern magic. In the story of the Silver Elves, there was the legend of the prophet Halidol. This legend was even passed down to this day. Some legends described Halidol as an elegant stag as large as a mountain. So today, in the south of Cruz and Erewhon, people still thought that the white stag was a symbol of guidance, and that it could lead lost hunters out of the forest. These legends clearly pointed to a possibility that someone had artificially spread civilization in that era, and these people were likely to be the Druids of the Ring of the World, because Brando saw in the last few fragments of the images that they used the blood of gods to create monsters and the Myurnas. The Myurnas were the last golden folk of the previous era. Unlike the dragons and several other golden folk, the Myurnas' individual strength was far inferior to their predecessors. As golden folk, they had only two most obvious characteristics, which were the golden blood and the color of their eyes. The second was that after the body was perfected, they would directly enter the realm of golden folk. However, the Myurnas' infant strength was extremely weak, and the average strength of the population was far inferior to the other golden folk. They also had a larger population, which once spread throughout the territory ruled by the Mardos Empire and formed dozens of legions. Such a population was beyond the reach of most golden folk. According to the records in the Pale Poem, the golden folk were born from the blood and corpses of the gods, created by the gods. Then everything that followed could be explained. The Druids of the Ring of the World were once the most important guardians of the world's order. They monitored the spread of the Black Forest on the border of the civilized world and planted the seeds of fire. According to the literature of the Mithril Society, after the destruction of Babel Fortress and during the War of the Holy Saints, there were two major splits in the history of the Druids. In particular, the latter split gave birth to the special group of tree herders. The tree herders once followed Odin and established a terrifying army of tree herders. After Odin's failure, they split up and went underground. When they reappeared in the world, they had changed into a madman organization. Unlike the All-for-One Society, which was also a cult and the sworn enemy of the four holy cathedrals, the tree herders worshipped the power of chaos, but that was only power. They were obsessed with stealing the blood of the gods in order to gain the power of the gods and control the whole world. That was why people thought they were a group of lunatics. But speaking of which, when did the tradition of tree herders creating oracles originate? The fragmented images in the dream seem to have given the answer. If the Druids had been using the blood of the gods long before the split, it could even be traced back to a time long after the destruction of Babel Fortress. Then everything made sense. The blood of the gods had been cut off after the destruction of Babel Fortress. It might have even begun to decline before that. Odin had the blood of the gods, but it was not pure. But at that time, the fact that a bloodline like his could still become the leader of the world of order was enough to show the decline of this bloodline. The gods no longer appeared in the world, just like how the gods left Wound one by one. The decline of civilization forced the Druids, the guardians of order, to choose a different path, to use the blood of the gods to bring the gods back to the world. But it was easy to imagine how difficult it was. Even in the glorious era, the gods only created the golden race from the corpses of the gods. From this point of view, the Druids could be said to have succeeded. They created the Myurnas, the most distinctive golden race. But at least they did have the blood of the golden race. In a sense, the Druids of the Ring of the World represented the authority of the gods. This was what he saw in the third world in the dream. But Brando thought that it was still a bit of a fantasy for the Druids to create the golden race with their own hands. He was more inclined to another guess, that the Druids were fulfilling the unfinished business of the pioneers. That was to say, before the destruction of Babel Fortress, the remaining gods might have already set out to continue their bloodline, but this experiment was likely to be interrupted or failed due to the invasion of the Twilight Dragon. Judging from the age of the birth of the Azure Knight, he was likely to be the product of this experiment, the first generation of the Myurnas, and the most perfect Myurnas. After the destruction of Babel Fortress, the fire of civilization and countless documents once stored in the glorious city all fell apart. Some were carried out by the refugees, but most of them were lost in the thousands of years of exile of the Silver Race. Everything about the divine people's final experiment was also lost on the land. The surviving Druids of the Ring of the World might have obtained bits and pieces of information about the plan through some unknown means, and only then did they complete the plan. And the completed Myurnas were the Myurnas who built Mardos. Among these Myurnas, the blood of the Azure Knight had been passed down from generation to generation. It could be said that they were the purest inheritors of the gods until the fall of Odin, which announced the end of an era. Brando remembered the scenes he saw of the monsters created by the Druids escaping into the forest. He suddenly remembered something. The hidden paragraph in the Pale poem was about the end of the Silver Race and the rise of the Iron Race. How did the Iron Race appear on the earth? He suddenly remembered this famous question, which was one of the most discussed questions in the Amber Sword. The Silver and Gold races were all from the hand of God, and now the Myurnas also had their origins, but what about the Iron Race? In the historical records, the Black Iron folk were the subjects and slaves of the Myurna people when they were born. They were the barbarians of the forests and mountains at the beginning. Later, they were influenced by the Empire and had their own civilization. This was the origin of the Iron Race recorded in history. According to this theory, the Black Iron folk should be the native species of the Dark Forest. Judging from the records on the parchment scroll, it seemed to be true. The Black Iron folk were called hybrids by the Silver folk and the Gold folk in the earliest era. Because these barbarians that walked out of the forest had the same dark magic aura as the demons and the Dusk species. In the eyes of the true beings of order, they should be no different from the demons. Especially when the Black Iron folk of that era did not have their own civilization, language, and writing. There were also humanoid demons in the Dark Forest, and the barbarians did not look too different from them. But the biggest difference between the Iron Race and the monsters was that they were true creatures of order. They could sense the power of the elements under the law of Tiamat, ignite the fire seed, and develop the elements. This was the most basic characteristic of the people of order. Facts also proved this point. The Iron Race quickly integrated into the civilized world in the later era, and took over the torch of civilization from the Silver Race's hands, and continued to this day. But were the Iron Race really the original race? Brando's mind repeatedly replayed the scene of the Druids creating the Myurnas. Those powerful sages in robes, they created all kinds of monsters, giants surrounded by lightning, monsters with surging flames, and superhuman beings with all kinds of abilities. Hundreds and thousands of failed creations were immediately killed, and a few trembling Myurnas were abandoned in the wilderness. Some of the monsters who were lucky enough to escape wandered into the groups of civilized creatures, some caused wars, and some were worshipped as gods. These monsters, they all had a common name, and they were called the Oracles. It was like Scarlet, like he was in existence like himself. Brando gently shook his head, and decided to filter these complicated thoughts out of his mind, because there were too many guesses, and some were simply impossible to judge. These chaotic thoughts seemed to rush into his mind as he woke up. He could acutely feel the shadow of the blood of the Dark God behind him, which meant that this part of the memory came from the blood of the Dark God. It seemed that the so-called black orb was not as simple as it looked. Thinking of this, he raised his head and looked at Sydney. Chapter 1022. From the beginning to the end, Sydney just watched silently, neither objecting nor helping. Her brows were slightly furrowed, her mouth was closed, and her face was serious. It was as if she was not in the forest in the west of Metz, but in the solemn sanctuary of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. When Brando saw her, he could not help but think that this was indeed the statue of the Sacred Lady of the Leo Palace. He also saw the ragged golden-red robe on Sydney's body and understood that her appearance here was not smooth sailing. It was probably not a coincidence that she found him. There was no doubt that she did not stand on the side of Her Majesty the Queen's new religion. Her relationship with Vala was that of a teacher and a friend, and she was a very principled person. It was impossible for her to betray the teachings of the Golden Flame Way. "Sorry, my mind is a little messy," he explained. "It's okay," Sydney replied. "Thank you for saving me." Sydney nodded his head in reply. Brendel replied as he observed the surroundings. The forest was quiet, and the leaves were green like a carpet. Not far away, there was a stream that flowed between the rocks. A deer in the forest pricked up its ears and looked in this direction vigilantly. It was a quiet and peaceful scene. It seemed that this place was still in the previous valley, but there were no traces of fighting. It seemed that in the end, they fell far away. He did not know if Bai was nearby, or if even his soul had completely disappeared. Brando could not help but have a headache. It seemed that Medisha still respected her royal sister. He did not know how she would react to this result. If she resented him because of this, he could only accept it. After all, if he was given another chance, he would make the same choice. It was too dangerous for that woman to stay in the world. But he was most worried that Medisha would be depressed because of this. He could not bear to let her be hurt again. Thinking of this, he was slightly stunned, then shook his head to throw these troubles away and asked, "How long have I been unconscious?" Sydney saw the anxiety on his face and replied, "Not long after, I saw you fall from the sky and rushed here. It's only been a quarter of an hour." "Only a short while." Brando was slightly surprised. "Madam, you are." Although he recognized Sydney, he decided to pretend that he did not know him. After all, he had never seen him before. Sydney introduced herself. She was indeed the famous statue of the Adoratress of the Lion Palace, one of the high-level archbishops of the Holy Cathedral of Fire. After Sydney introduced herself, she did not wait for Brando to speak and took the initiative to say, "I'm here to see you, my lord." "Looking for me?" Brando thought that it was indeed the case. "Of course," he still asked. Sydney glanced at him and took down a bundle from his back without saying a word. Brando then noticed that she was also carrying a bundle on her back. The bundle was long and wrapped in layers of grey cloth. Even Sydney's robe was tattered, but this bundle was well protected and did not even have much dust on it. She laid the bundle flat on a rock and opened it, revealing many large and small pieces of shiny silver metal and a pitch-black sword hilt. The hammer at the end of the sword hilt was very ingenious. It was actually carved into the shape of a silver flame. These fragments were obviously fragments of a broken sword, and a person of Sydney's status would not pay so much attention to a broken sword, so the origin of these fragments was self-evident. Sure enough, Sydney carefully sorted out these fragments one by one. After confirming that there was not a single piece left, she solemnly looked up at him. "This is the holy sword Oderfeis," she replied solemnly, as if a sacred tone could revive the sword. "So you're here for the sword spirit of Oderfeis." Brando suddenly understood and remembered that such a thing was sleeping in his body. Speaking of which, there were a lot of miscellaneous things in his body. Previously, there was the soul of the Wind Empress, the inheritance of the Dark Dragon, the Thunder Core, the power of the Planeswalker, the Elite Template, of course, now it had become the Leader Template and the Unknown Game System. Now, there was the blood of the dark god and some other messy memories. It was not appropriate to call it a garbage dump, but to call it a moving treasure trove would always give the illusion that it would be dropped at any time. In short, it was not a good feeling. After Sydney put down the fragment of Oderfice, she did not pursue the topic further. Instead, she said, "Before leaving the imperial capital, I met Earl Latch of War once." Brando was stunned for a moment before he realized that the Earl was referring to Scarlet. He could not help but feel a little amused. He fought with his life and death in Erewhon and only obtained a fief the size of Tonagel. Moreover, the title of Earl was not legitimate because Tonagel was not a Earl's fief. In fact, his title of Earl came from Radnor, but the royal faction was unwilling to let him become the owner of Radnor. If not for the fact that the leader of this diplomatic group needed a title, he did not know how long his title of Earl would have been delayed. Even now, it was just a title. And Scarlet had only walked around Cruz once, and suddenly she was on equal footing with him. Oh, it was not quite right to say that they were on equal footing. Scarlet's fief was the Latch of War, the hometown of the mountain people. It was located in the mountains between Ludwig and Mihodafen. In terms of area, it was at least half the size of Erewhon's. Not to mention that Scarlet was a real Earl of the Empire. In terms of value, she was many times more valuable than a half-assed Earl like him. However, when he suddenly heard news about Scarlet, he was still excited. Although he knew that Scarlet had been staying in the imperial capital, he had not heard any news about her for almost a few months. He did not know if the girl who was not good with words had been wronged, if she was under house arrest by Her Majesty the Queen, how she was doing, if she was troubled. There were too many questions, and he did not know how to start. "Scarlet, is she well?" he asked. Her Majesty the Queen did not trouble her, because no one can force the azure lance, Sydney replied. "But I heard that Her Majesty intends to betroth her to Piano's son." Sydney suddenly stopped talking because she keenly felt that the surrounding temperature suddenly dropped by several degrees. The forest rustled as if it was shivering. She looked up with some surprise and saw that the falling leaves were suspended in the air around Brando's body. A burst of white frost quickly spread across the surrounding meadow, and the swaying leaves instantly turned white to the tip of the leaves, and then turned into ice dust. In the field of time and space imprisonment, the movement of molecules was completely stagnant, and the space within a few feet was instantly reduced to nothingness. Brando was shocked to find that he had lost control of his power in his rage. He quickly retracted his mind, and then realized that it was because his power had grown too quickly that caused him to lose control. Fortunately, he reacted quickly, or the rampaging law would have hurt him. "Piano, the chief of the mountain people?" he asked coldly. Sydney looked at him, and then nodded. "His son is worthy. No one is qualified to make my subordinates marry. Your Majesty the Queen only has this little vision. This should be just a statement, but if Count Latch insists on not bowing his head, Her Majesty the Queen will do so," Sydney said. Brando suddenly felt a little irritated, for some reason he could not explain. "That stupid girl, what's wrong with bowing her head for a while? Can I not trust her?" He did not know who he was scolding, but he complained first, and then sighed softly and calmed down again. Sydney saw his expression and was not surprised. "Your Excellency the Count, Her Majesty the Queen got different from you in the final battle. Odin gave her not only power, but also authority, so the Dragon Queen, the Lion people, the Myrnas, and the Senia people all agreed with her. Even Madara did not resist Her Majesty. She suddenly said, 'But Your Excellency the Count, you got the bloodline of the War Dragon. In this regard, you are far inferior to her. And she has more time than you. After decades of careful planning and preparation, her trump cards are far more than what you see. It will be difficult for you to only rely on the eldest son to fight against her.' You all know." Brando reacted. We will know after your battle with Williams, Your Excellency. Brando could not help but smile bitterly. So that was it. He thought he had hidden it well, but he did not expect that the upper echelons of the Holy Cathedral of Fire already knew that he had the inheritance of the Darkness Dragon. He was a little curious. If that's the case, why are you indifferent? This is the same as the Farnesane's indifference. As for the reason, I'm sure you've already guessed it. That's why it's unrealistic for you to hope that the Farnesane or any other faction will interfere in this war. The Bugas may support you, but that is only a part of them. The Silver City is divided all year round, and they are also divided into many factions. Sidney quickly answered his doubts. Brando shook his head again. In fact, he had expected it. Since the conversation with Tumen, he found that this matter was not as simple as it seemed on the surface. If even the Holy Cathedral of Fire could be divided into two, how could Farnesane's Holy Church of Light be an exception? Therefore, Farnesane's Pope choosing to bide his time was also one of the possibilities. Everything that was happening before their eyes was not too far out of their expectations. Is that why you came to me, Miss Sidney? Sidney nodded his head honestly. The Silver Queen intends to restore the dynasty of the Myrnas. Saint Vara and I could not agree with her approach. She put the Saint Vara under house arrest, and I escaped from the capital alone. Her Majesty the Queen has won over the scholastics and made many people stand on the side of the Protestantism, but in the local areas, there are still many people who support the views of the Saint Vara. These people in Ludwig and Metz influence the opinions of a large number of nobles. If you only order them in the name of the eldest son of the Emperor, it will not have much effect. Can't they reach a consensus in the face of a great enemy? This is a war of doctrines. Who to listen to is a very serious question. That's true. Brando realized that he had thought of the problem too simply. In fact, the Prime Minister's daughter had also raised a similar problem with him, but she was not an authority in the religious world, so the weight of her words was not on the same level. He looked at the fragment of the holy sword Oderfeis in Sidney's hand. He asked, Lady Sidney, what do you mean? The Sanctum Sanctorum asked me to find you because he wanted you to reforge this sword and use the flaming blade as a token to clean up the holy sanctorum. He said that he wanted you to show another possibility in history. Sidney paused and explained, these were His Excellency Vara's original words. Brando's eyes widened in surprise. He had thought that his psychological endurance was good enough, but he did not expect that it was still not good enough in front of Saint Vara, who would not give up until she said something shocking. He understood the meaning of this sentence and could not help but ask in disbelief, Lady Sidney, do you think this is a fairy tale? You mean to ask me to lead the Holy Cathedral of Fire? Do you really understand the meaning of this sentence? This is not a joke. Even in the most bizarre bedside legends, I have never heard of such a story. There was only one meaning in Vara's words, and that was to pass on the position of the Holy See to him. However, Brando admitted that he did not have the so-called God-given leadership temperament, so that people would understand at a glance that he was a destined person, a destined king, and people would bow their heads and worship him. Most of the time, he had relied on his foresight to get to where he was today. Sometimes, he would go overboard, and sometimes, he would manage to subdue a group of witches as his subordinates. However, he had never taken it seriously. Instead, he had become increasingly uninterested in these things. From the loop of trade winds to the Battle of Ampere Seal, he had always taken one step at a time. He had paid countless blood and lives to barely change Erwin's future. But today, a big shot of the Holy Cathedral of Fire suddenly came in front of him and said that he wanted to be the Holy See. Was this not a joke? This was simply a joke. He shook his head in confusion and said earnestly, Miss Sidney, I know that the soul of Oderfeis is sleeping in my body, so you have no choice but to come and beg me. But if you urgently need my help, I am actually willing to form an alliance with you to help you reforge this holy sword because we now have a common enemy and goal. But as for the ownership of this holy sword and the position of the holy sea, I am really not interested." Brando spread his hands and said, "Let's take 10,000 steps back. First of all, I am not a cruise person. In addition, before this, I have never understood the teachings of the Way of the Golden Flames and have no interest in the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Are you sure that an outsider like me will lead the Holy Cathedral? Not to mention you, even I don't know what direction I will lead you to." He had a preconceived notion that the Holy Cathedral of Fire had come up with such a ridiculous idea because the soul of Odorfice was in his body. As for the empty promise, everything else would be easy if he was tempted first. After all, the Holy Cathedral of Fire was such a behemoth. Could he command the world just by holding a holy sword? That was a story in fantasy novels. If the people below ignored him, not to mention the holy sword Odorfice, even if he held the amber sword, it would be useless. He did not want to be a puppet at all. If the Holy Cathedral wanted to form an alliance with him, then it would be better for everyone to take a step back and find a more sincere way. But what Brando did not expect was that Sydney's expression became serious. Although she had always been very serious, she was even more serious now. She looked at him and replied solemnly, "Your Excellency, what do you think the teachings of the Way of the Golden Flames are?" "Order and protection. It is not as difficult to understand as you think. His Excellency Vala chose you, and the Holy Sword Odorfice also chose you. I believe it is not too wrong." Brando was so stunned that he forgot what he was going to say. "Are you serious, Lady Sydney?" Sydney nodded, then shook her head. "I am just following the choice of the Holy Sword Odorfice. Perhaps you still don't understand the meaning of the flaming blade, but it doesn't matter. I believe you will eventually understand." Brando shook his head. "I still need to think about it. I think it is better to be more cautious about this matter. As for the recasting of the flaming blade, I will consider it." As he spoke, he stood up from the ground and looked up in the direction of the valley. He was a little worried about Senior and Medisha. He asked, "I am going to find my companions. Are you coming with me, lady?" Sydney nodded, as if she did not care about the question. She put away her bag again and stood up. "You're tuning in to the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure."